Strange figures appear carved into ancient stone, wearing what look like helmets and carrying peculiar bags. Sumerian clay tablets, thousands of years old, list the reigns of kings who lived for tens of thousands of years before a great flood wiped the slate clean. Across the globe, from the Andes to India, foundational myths speak of powerful gods who descended from the heavens in flying chariots or fiery ships, bringing knowledge, laws, and often devastating wars. These aren't just a few isolated campfire stories. They are a persistent planetary echo of a time when humanity, it seems, was not alone. It's a story whispered in our oldest texts, a mystery baked into the very bedrock of civilization. Why do so many independent cultures tell such a strikingly similar tale? Tonight, we're going to follow that thread back to its very beginning. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And just so we can all feel a little more connected in this shared story, go ahead and boast your city or country and what time it is for you. It's always nice to see where everyone is tuning in from. Our story begins not on Earth, but in the cold, distant darkness of interstellar space, on a world wandering through the night. This world is called Nibiru. It doesn't move in a gentle, predictable circle around its star like our own planet does. Instead, its path is a vast, dramatic ellipse, a stretched-out journey that takes it far beyond the familiar orbits of planets like Jupiter and Saturn, out into the crushing blackness where the sun is just another bright star. For millennia, it glides through the silent cold, and then, on a schedule measured in thousands of years, gravity pulls it back inward, arcing it on a slingshot trajectory through the heart of our solar system before flinging it back out into the void again. Imagine a commute that lasts 3,600 years one way. It certainly puts the morning traffic into perspective. The beings who lived there, the Nibiruns, had built a magnificent, soaring civilization. Their science was masterful. Their lifespans were counted in cosmic timescales, and their understanding of the universe was profound. But they had a problem, a slow, creeping, existential crisis that all their advanced knowledge could not seem to halt. Their world was dying. The very air was thinning. Nibiru's atmosphere, the precious shield that protected them from the harsh radiation of deep space and insulated them from the bitter cold of their long journey away from the sun, was failing. It was eroding, molecule by molecule, bleeding away into the vacuum. The light on Nibiru had taken on a pale, sickly quality, a permanent crimson twilight that seemed to sap the color from their golden cities. The winds blew with a new, mournful chill, a constant reminder of the encroaching emptiness. Their scientists, the most brilliant minds of their age, had debated the problem for generations. They ran simulations, launched probes, argued in great crystalline halls. And finally, they had arrived at a solution. It was elegant, audacious, and unimaginably difficult. They needed to mend their sky. The plan was to find vast quantities of a very specific element. Gold, not for wealth, not for ornament, but for its unique properties. If they could pulverize this gold into a superfine monoatomic dust and seed it into the highest layers of their atmosphere, it would, in theory, create a reflective shield. It would act like a blanket of microscopic mirrors, deflecting harmful radiation and holding in the planet's precious heat and air. It was planetary-scale geoengineering, a last, desperate bid to save themselves by literally wallpapering over the cracks in their world with shimmering dust. There was just one catastrophic flaw in this brilliant plan. They had no gold, not nearly enough. Nibiru, for all its wonders, was a geologically poor world in that respect. Over the centuries, they had mined every last flake, every vein, every trace element from their planetary crust. Their treasuries were empty, their mines were barren, and their atmosphere continued to decay. The problem had shifted from a scientific one to a logistical nightmare. The search began. The Nibirans were masters of space travel, and they cast their nets wide. They sent automated probes and mining ships to every asteroid and moonlet within their reach as their planet arced through the outer darkness. They found other minerals in abundance, metals and crystals of every kind. But gold remained stubbornly, maddeningly elusive. The crisis, once a quiet concern for scientists, now gripped the entire planet. Anxiety was a low hum beneath the surface of their orderly society. The long reigning dynasty, a line of kings who traced their ancestry back to the dawn of their civilization, was under immense pressure to deliver a miracle. And as they wheeled back toward the inner solar system, their long-range scanners and telescopic arrays were pushed to their absolute limits, desperately searching for a glimmer of hope. It's an interesting little echo that modern astronomers on our own world are currently searching for a theoretical, massive object in the outer solar system, a so-called Planet 9, whose gravitational influence seems to be tugging on the orbits of other distant bodies. Historians still argue whether the ancient Sumerian name Nibiru, which means planet of the crossing, was a reference to a real astronomical body, or merely a mythological concept representing a celestial gatekeeper, like the god Marduk. But for the Nibiruns, this crossing was no myth. It was their reality. Their planet was a ship, and they were sailing it through a solar system that was both a source of immense danger and their only potential salvation. From their observatories, they watched the inner planets grow from tiny sparks into distinct disks of color. The gas giants, Jupiter and Saturn, loomed like colossal, swirling titans, and beyond them, closer to the sun's warmth, was a cluster of smaller, rocky worlds. One of them, the seventh one they counted on their inward journey, glowed with a tantalizing mix of deep blues and swirling whites. Their probes sent back preliminary data that was almost too good to be true. The planet was water-rich, teeming with life, and its spectral analysis showed undeniable, unbelievable spikes, traces of immense quantities of metal, heavy elements settled deep within its crust. Among them, shining like a beacon of hope in the cold light of their spectral charts, was gold. More gold than they could have possibly imagined. It was there, the cure for their dying world. The only question was how to get it. The journey would be treacherous, the environment hostile, and the task of setting up a massive mining operation light years from home was daunting. But they had no other choice. Their world was fading, and on that distant blue and white marble was the dust of life they so desperately needed. The news of a gold-rich planet, the seventh from the sun, should have brought dancing in the streets of Nibiru's crystalline cities. It should have been a moment of planetary unity, a collective sigh of relief. Instead, it dripped like a potent poison into the already fractured heart of the royal court. The discovery didn't solve the problem. It merely raised the stakes of a much older, much more personal conflict. At the center of this galactic-level family drama was the king, Anu, and his two sons, who were as different as the deep, thoughtful darkness of space and the rigid, blazing light of a star. The firstborn was named Ea, a brilliant mind, a master of science and genetics, with a curiosity that pushed him to explore every corner of the cosmos. He was the one who had championed the deep space surveys, the one whose teams had analyzed the data from the blue and white planet. His very name was prophetic. He whose home is water, a perfect description for the one who now dreamt of the vast oceans of this newfound world. He was, by every measure of intellect and experience, the logical choice to lead the salvation mission. But Nibiruan law was a tangled, ancient thing, built on millennia of tradition and the sacred purity of bloodlines. And by its rigid decree, Ea was not the heir to the throne. That title belonged to his younger half-brother, Enlil. Enlil was born of Anu's union with his half-sister, a coupling that, according to their succession laws, produced a bloodline of supreme purity. This legal technicality, a concept mirrored in some ancient terrestrial dynasties like those of the Egyptian pharaohs, made Enlil the crown prince, the undisputed future ruler. Where Ea was a scientist, Enlil was an administrator. His name meant Lord of the Command, and he embodied it completely. He was a being of discipline, order, and protocol. He saw the universe not as a place of wonder to be explored, but as a system to be managed and controlled. He viewed his brother's freewheeling curiosity with suspicion, seeing it as reckless and undisciplined, and he saw the mission to this new planet, which he called Earth, not as a scientific endeavor, but as a military and industrial operation that required his firm hand. The tension between them was a palpable force in the throne room, a silent, crackling energy that warped the space around them. Anu, weary and old, found himself trapped between his brilliant but illegitimate firstborn and his stern but lawful heir. He knew Ea was the right choice to lead the mission, the only one with the scientific acumen to handle the unknown challenges of a new world. But appointing him would be a slap in the face to Enlil, a public declaration that tradition and law were secondary to mere competence. It would undermine the very foundation of Enlil's future reign. The council meetings became endless, circular debates. Ea would present his meticulous plans for exploration and careful extraction. Enlil would counter with logistical charts, chains of command, and concerns about security. All the while, the crimson sky outside grew a little thinner, the air a little colder. The planet was gasping for breath, and its leaders were locked in the universe's most high-stakes HR dispute. This paralysis, this indecisive rot at the very top of the government, did not go unnoticed. There were other members of the royal family, distant cousins and uncles, who watched the endless bickering with growing impatience. One such being was Alalu. He was a former king, from a dynasty that had been unseated by Anu. Though he held a seat on the council, he was a being nursing a deep and bitter grievance. He saw Anu as a weak and indecisive ruler, a king who allowed his personal family squabbles to jeopardize the fate of their entire civilization. He watched as the two princes circled each other, their rivalry a slow dance of death for Nibiru. In their weakness, Alalu saw his opportunity. He began to gather allies in secret, other council members who were frustrated with the stalemate, military commanders who respected strength above all else. He promised them what Anu could not: swift, decisive action. He would not debate, he would command, he would not hesitate, he would act. The moment came not with the clash of armies, but with the shocking suddenness of a palace coup. Alalu, flanked by his loyalists, strode into the grand throne room, bypassing all protocol. The guards, loyal to their commanders who were now with Alalu, simply stood aside. He faced Anu on the steps of the great throne, not as a councilman, but as a challenger. The accounts of what happened next are clouded in the biased histories written by the victors, but the outcome was clear. There was no great battle. Anu, seeing the betrayal in the eyes of his own court, and perhaps wishing to avoid a civil war that would shatter their already fragile world, yielded. Whether he was forced into exile or simply stepped down to become a figurehead is a matter of some debate. But his power was broken. Alalu seized the throne, placing the heavy crown of Nibiru upon his own head. He was now the king, but it was a victory built on sand. He had power, but not legitimacy. The supporters of Anu and his sons still saw him as a usurper. He knew that to truly secure his reign, he needed more than a crown. He needed to be the savior of their world. He needed to be the one who brought back the gold. And so, the mission to the seventh planet, to Earth, was no longer just a mission of survival. It was a political gambit of the highest order. Alalu, the new king, had to succeed where Anu had failed. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. For on this one desperate mission rested not only the future of his planet, but the future of his stolen throne. A throne won by force is often held for only a fleeting moment. Alalu's victory, so swift and decisive, began to crumble almost immediately. The silent acquiescence of the court was not loyalty, it was shock. And once that shock wore off, the foundations of his rule proved to be nothing but dust. Enu, though momentarily unseated, was not without power. He was the patriarch of a lineage stretching back into the mists of time. And his sons, for all their bitter rivalry, would not stand for a usurper. The commander Enlil, ever the guardian of legitimate authority, and the scientist Ea, who despised the thuggish Alalu for his contempt of knowledge, formed a rare, unified front behind their father. A challenge was issued, not a call to civil war, which would have been the final death blow to their world, but a summons to a more ancient rite: single combat for the kingship. It was a tradition from a more primitive era, a naked contest of strength to decide who was truly fit to rule. Alalu, trapped by the very traditions he sought to command, had no choice but to accept. On the great central platform of the palace, before the assembled nobility, the old king Anu and the usurper Alalu wrestled for the crown. The struggle was brief. Anu, channeling generations of royal strength, cast Alalu down, defeated, humiliated, and now facing certain execution. Alalu saw only one path left. In the chaos of the restored court, he made his escape, But his was not the quiet flight of a coward. It was the desperate, vengeful act of a fallen king. He bluffed his way to the main spaceport, to the heavily guarded silo that housed their most advanced spacecraft. He didn't just steal a ship, he stole a chariot of the gods, a vessel armed with 7 weapons of terror, nuclear missiles capable of leveling cities. It was the ultimate act of spite, like a disgraced CEO leaving the office with the company's most dangerous trade secrets. If he was going down, he was going to hold a gun to the head of the entire system. He launched his stolen ship into the dying crimson sky, a lone fugitive burning a trail of defiance out into the blackness. His destination was a suicidal gamble, his only remaining hope, the 7th planet, Earth. He knew that possessing the planet of gold was the only bargaining chip powerful enough to save his life. If he could get there first and claim it, he could dictate terms. He could trade salvation for his own survival. His journey was a 9-month nightmare through the void. Loneliness was a physical presence in the humming cockpit, a constant companion, as Nibiru shrank behind him to a baleful red star. His greatest test came as he approached the 5th planet, Jupiter. To get to the inner solar system, he had to navigate the treacherous expanse of the asteroid belt, a celestial minefield their ancient texts called the Hammered Bracelet. Scholars on Earth would one day debate whether this term, found on Sumerian tablets, was proof of an impossible, ancient knowledge of the solar system's true layout. For Alalu, it wasn't a scholarly debate. It was a terrifying reality. Asteroids, some the size of mountains, tumbled silently through the darkness around him. His ship's navigation system screamed warnings as he dodged and weaved, the vessel shuddering with near misses and the occasional glancing blow from smaller debris. He emerged on the other side with his ship battered, its hull scarred, and at least one system failing. But he was alive. Before him now, the inner planets grew in his viewport. The rusty red of Mars slipped by, and then his target swelled into view, a hypnotic, swirling jewel of blue, white, and green. Earth. It was more vibrant, more alive than any of the cold, sterile charts had suggested. He plunged the ship into the upper atmosphere, and the universe turned to fire. The damaged vessel bucked and screamed as friction turned the air outside into a plasma sheath. Alarms blared, the cockpit filled with the smell of burning circuits. And through the viewport, there was nothing but an incandescent orange glare. He fought the controls, wrestling the dying craft toward the land masses he could glimpse between the clouds. He had no control over his final destination. He was simply trying to survive the fall. The ship slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring impact that threw him against his restraints. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the hiss of failing electronics. He had made it. He was alive. With trembling hands, he unstrapped himself and forced open the main hatch. The air that hit him was thick, wet, and heavy with the smell of salt and decay. His ship had crash-landed in a vast, swampy marshland at the edge of a great sea, the area that would one day be known as the Persian Gulf. He stumbled out onto the muddy ground, his magnificent ship a wreck behind him. He was a king without a kingdom, a fugitive on a world of primordial beauty, but he had not come this far to admire the scenery. He deployed the ship's remaining scanner probes. He waded into the murky water, scooping up handfuls of silt and running them through the onboard chemical analyzers. The results flashed on his screen, a glorious, beautiful confirmation. Gold. It was here, mixed into the very soil, carried down by the rivers, waiting to be harvested. It was real. He had been right. Working feverishly, Alalu rerouted the last of his ship's power to the primary communications array. He aimed it back toward the faint red dot of Nibiru and sent his message across the silent gulf of space. It was a message of triumph and defiance, a final gamble from the edge of the abyss. The message was received in the court of King Anu. The gold on earth was real. It was plentiful, and Alalu, the fugitive, was claiming it as his own. Alalu's message tore through the royal court of Nibiru like a shockwave, a transmission from a dead man, a ghost broadcasting from across the solar system, was shocking enough. But the content of his message sent the council into a state of barely controlled panic. The gold was real. Their salvation was within reach, but it was in the hands of a desperate, armed, and unstable traitor. Alalu's message wasn't a humble plea for forgiveness. It was a demand. He had positioned himself as the gatekeeper to their survival, and he had 7 city-destroying missiles to back up his claim. It was the most audacious hostage negotiation in the history of the universe, and the hostage was their own future. King Anu convened the Great Assembly, the silence in the chamber so heavy you could feel it pressing down. The faint, static-laced recording of Alalu's voice was played, his words echoing with a chilling mix of triumph and madness. When it finished, the debate began, and the ancient fault line between Anu's 2 sons split wide open once more. Enlil, his face a mask of cold fury, spoke first. To the Lord of the Command, the situation was simple, a matter of law and order. Alalu was a fugitive who had committed treason, theft of state property, and now extortion. He argued for an immediate, overwhelming military response. A fleet of warships should be dispatched to this Earth. The usurper's vessel should be disabled or destroyed, and Alalu should be captured and brought back in chains to face public justice. To negotiate with him, to even acknowledge his demands, would be to reward terrorism. It would set a precedent that any disgruntled noble could steal a ship, make a claim, and hold the entire kingdom for ransom. Enlil's logic was impeccable, his reasoning sound, but it was the rigid, unbending logic of a commander who saw the world in black and white. He was prepared to risk a violent confrontation, even if it meant Alalu, in a final act of spite, might use his weapons and potentially contaminate the very prize they sought. Then, Ea stepped forward. The scientist's approach was, as always, more nuanced. He was not concerned with legal precedents or Alalu's honor. He was concerned with results. The mission to Earth was, and had to remain, a scientific and industrial undertaking. An armed response is a fool's errand, he argued, his voice calm and measured. We know nothing of this world. Is its atmosphere breathable? Is the water potable? What of the native life forms? And most importantly, what of Alalu himself? He is a cornered animal. If he sees a fleet of warships approaching, he will not hesitate to use the weapons of terror. He may destroy himself, his ship with all its precious data, and render the entire region a radioactive wasteland for centuries. It was a chillingly effective counter-argument. Sending in the Marines could mean losing everything. Ea proposed a different path, a single ship, a small, hand-picked crew of 50 specialists. It would be a scientific mission, not an invasion. Their primary goal would be to confirm Alalu's findings, assess the planet's resources and dangers, and establish a foothold. Dealing with Alalu was a secondary objective, something to be handled with careful negotiation, not brute force. King Anu, listening to his sons, saw the wisdom in Ea's caution. The stakes were too high for Enlil's rigid pride. He made his decision. A mission would be sent, and it would be led by his firstborn. But he knew that Ea, the scientist, lacked the formal authority to command such a vital undertaking. So, in a move of profound political significance, Anu bestowed upon his son a new title and a new name. From that day forward, Ea would be known as Enki, a name meaning Lord of Earth. It was a masterstroke. It gave him the authority he needed, specifically tying his command to the new world, while not directly challenging Enlil's overall title as Lord of the Command. It was a promotion and a compromise all in one, and Enlil could do nothing but simmer in silent resentment as his brother was celebrated. Preparations for the journey began at once. Enki handpicked his crew: geologists, biologists, pilots, engineers. These were not soldiers. They were pioneers. The great interstellar vessel was provisioned and prepared. The Nibirans were masters of long-duration spaceflight. The challenges that would one day plague early human astronauts, like bone density loss in zero gravity and exposure to cosmic radiation, were problems they had solved millennia ago. Their ships were equipped with advanced shielding and onboard systems that generated artificial gravity, making the 9-month journey long, but not debilitating. As Enki stood on the launch platform, looking out at the dimming crimson landscape of his homeworld, he felt the immense weight of his task. He was not just an explorer anymore. He was the bearer of his people's last hope. The great ship lifted from its cradle on a pillar of brilliant light, a single spark of hope escaping a dying world. The journey was smooth, a testament to their technology. They passed through the hammered bracelet, not with the terror of a fugitive, but with the cool precision of seasoned pilots. And then, after months of travel through the silent dark, they saw it. Earth. Enki stood in the command center, looking down at the swirling blue and white sphere. It was the same sight that had greeted Alalu, but Enki's heart was filled not with desperate ambition, but with a scientist's awe and a commander's caution. He was here to build, not to bargain. But he knew, somewhere down on that vibrant, living world, a disgraced king was waiting for him, nursing his grievances and sitting on enough firepower to end the mission before it even began. From the quiet, sterile bridge of his orbiting ship, Enki looked down upon the world that was now his domain. It was a canvas of impossible vitality, a riot of deep greens and brilliant blues that made his own dying planet a distant, painful memory. His scanners and probes had already confirmed everything. Alalu was down there, his wrecked ship a metal scar in the sprawling marshlands that fed into a great gulf. And the gold was there too, not in deep, hard-to-reach veins, but laced through the water and soil, an alluvial treasure washed down from the mountains over millions of years. This was it. the place of salvation. But first, he had to deal with the disgraced king playing gatekeeper with nuclear weapons. Caution was Enki's defining trait. He chose a landing site several leagues away from Alalu's crash site, on a patch of stable ground near the mouth of a large river. The descent was flawless, where Alalu had fallen from the sky in a ball of fire. Enki's great vessel settled onto the ground with barely a whisper, its anti-gravity engines displacing the strange, fern-like trees as gently as a passing breeze. The great ramp lowered, and the air that flooded the ship was an intoxicating shock. It was thick with humidity and carried 1,000 alien scents: damp earth, sweet-smelling blossoms, the salty tang of the nearby sea, and the musk of unseen creatures. For the 50 Anunnaki who followed Enki down the ramp, it was a staggering sensory experience. They were used to the thin, recycled air of their ships and the sterile atmosphere of their homeworld's enclosed cities. Here, life was an overwhelming, tangible force. The sun, a brilliant yellow star, so different from their own dim red one, beat down with an intensity that made them shield their eyes. Strange, winged creatures with colorful plumage flitted through the canopy, their calls a chaotic symphony. Enki knelt, running a handful of the rich, dark soil through his fingers. It was teeming with microscopic life. This wasn't just a mining outpost. It was the greatest biological laboratory in the universe. But science would have to wait. Leaving the bulk of his crew to secure the ship, Enki took a small, unarmed delegation and traveled by skimmer to Alalu's location. They found him just outside his crippled vessel, a haggard, paranoid figure who watched their approach with a hand near the ship's controls. The first diplomatic meeting on Earth was, to put it mildly, awkward. Enki didn't come with threats or demands. He came with logic. He acknowledged Alalu's monumental discovery, praising his courage and skill in making the journey. He gave the old king the credit he so desperately craved. Then he gently laid out the facts. Alalu's ship would never fly again. He could not possibly hope to extract the gold by himself. And he was, after all, still a fugitive. But, Enki offered, there was another way, a path to redemption. Help us, Enki proposed. Share your logs, your planetary data. Work with us, and your name will not be remembered as that of a traitor, but as the one who first found the path. Your legacy will be one of heroism. It was a lifeline, a way for Alalu to reclaim his honor without violence. Alalu, who had spent months alone, stewing in his own bitter pride, saw the undeniable truth in Enki's words. His grand gesture of defiance was over. He agreed. With the threat of a nuclear standoff averted, the real work could begin. The Anunnaki needed a city, a base of operations that could withstand the planet's strange weather and unknown dangers. Enki, with his deep understanding of geology and hydrology, selected the site where they had landed. He named it Eridu, home in the faraway, a name that was both poetic and painfully literal. Archaeologists, thousands of years in the future, would unearth the ruins of a city named Eridu in that same region of southern Iraq, and the ancient Sumerian king lists would claim it as the very first city on Earth, the place where kingship first descended from heaven. Using tools that pulsed with light and energy, the Anunnaki leveled the ground, fused the soil into a glass-like foundation, and erected their prefabricated structures. Within days, a small, shimmering, alien settlement stood in the heart of the primordial wilderness, a tiny outpost of Nibiru on a hostile new shore. Enki's initial plan for gold extraction was ingenious. Why dig into the earth when the water was full of it? He designed and built a series of massive filtration plants. Great pumps drew in water from the Gulf, processing thousands of gallons at a time, using complex electromagnetic fields and the chemical agents to separate the fine gold particles from the silt. For a while, it seemed to be working. The machinery hummed, the water flowed, and at the end of the long process, a small, shimmering trickle of pure, refined gold began to accumulate. It was a triumph of engineering, but as the weeks turned into months, a grim reality set in. The process is agonizingly slow. The yields were far lower than their scans had predicted. They were producing gold, yes, but it was a mere cupful when they needed a river. At this rate, it would take centuries to gather enough to save Nibiru. The first settlement was a success, but the mission itself was on the verge of failure. The gold wasn't in the water, it was in the earth, and to get it, they would have to dig. The Lord of the Earth realized he needed miners and machinery, not filters and pumps. And for that, he would need help. The methodical, rhythmic hum of the filtration plants at Eridu had once been a sound of hope for Enki and his crew. Now, it was a monotonous drone of failure. Day after day, the Anunnaki scientists and engineers monitored the separators, tweaked the magnetic fluxes, and cleaned the filters, only to produce a depressingly small amount of the precious metal, the gleaming pile of gold. The entire output of months of relentless work was barely enough to fill a single cargo container. It was a beautiful, shimmering testament to a flawed premise. Enki, the brilliant Lord of Earth, had to face a humbling reality. His elegant solution had been the wrong one. He had to send a progress report back to Nibiru, and it was the ancient astronaut equivalent of telling corporate headquarters that the entire business plan needed to be thrown out. The report was a masterclass in diplomatic language, praising the crew's efforts and the planet's potential, before getting to the unavoidable conclusion. Extracting gold from the water was inefficient. To get the quantities they needed in time, they would have to go deeper. They would need to start hard rock mining in the lands far to the south, a continent they had designated the Abzu. This, he wrote, would require a massive increase in manpower, heavy machinery, and a complete strategic overhaul. Back on Nibiru, in the tense atmosphere of Anu's court, Enki's report landed with the force of a perfectly aimed projectile, and the one who had thrown it was Enlil. As the report was read, a grim satisfaction settled on the commander's face. It was everything he had predicted. His scientist brother had treated the mission like a laboratory experiment, and now the experiment had failed. This was no longer a matter for geologists and biologists. It was a matter of supply chains, infrastructure, and labor management. It was a matter of pure command. Enlil stood before the council and made his case with chilling efficiency. "My brother is a brilliant scientist," he began, the praise dripping with condescension. "But he is not a commander. He has established a beachhead for which we are grateful. But now the real work begins. and it requires a firm hand. He argued that the mission's leadership needed to be on site, not ruling by committee from a distant planet. He, the Lord of the Command, needed to go to Earth and take personal control of the operation. Anu, seeing the logic and knowing the planet could not afford any more delays, had little choice but to agree. The mission was reauthorized, its scope massively expanded, and its new supreme commander would be Enlil. Enlil's arrival on Earth was a stark contrast to Enki's. His vessel was not a nimble exploration ship. It was a colossal transport, a flying headquarters that settled into the plains near Eridu with an earth-shaking finality. The Anunnaki of the first expedition watched in awe as hundreds more of their kind disembarked, their ranks and divisions moving with a military precision that had been absent from Enki's scientific outpost. With them came the components of massive machines, tunnel borers, laser cutters, and heavy lift transport vehicles. It was an invasion of industry. The reunion between the two brothers was colder than the deep space between their worlds. Enlil wasted no time on pleasantries. Standing before the assembled Anunnaki, with the original Eridu settlement looking like a mere campsite next to his mighty ship, he formally announced the change in leadership. By the authority of King Anu and the Council of Nibiru, he declared, his voice booming with authority, I am assuming command of Mission Earth. He then proceeded to lay out the new world order, a division of powers that would echo in the myths of the humans to come. In the religious traditions of ancient Mesopotamia, the cosmos was divided into three realms. The heavens above belonged to the sky god Anu. The surface of the earth was the domain of Enlil, and the waters and the underworld, known as the Abzu, belonged to Enki. On that day, Enlil turned this mythological structure into operational reality. He would remain here, in the land between the rivers, which he named Eden, and oversee the main effort. He would establish a central command, a series of new, specialized cities, and a proper spaceport for shipping the gold back to Nibiru. Enki, his title, Lord of Earth, now ringing hollow, was given a new, much more specific task. He was to take his original crew, along with a contingent of the newcomers, and proceed to the Abzu, the southern continent of Africa. There, in the sweltering jungles and deep rock, he would establish and oversee the deep mining operations. It was a demotion disguised as a vital assignment. Enlil was effectively banishing his brother to the farthest, most difficult corner of the planet, leaving himself in control of the far more civilized and strategic heart of the mission. The scientist was being sent to the mines, while the manager took over the head office. Enki, a master of controlling his emotions, accepted his new role with quiet dignity, but inside, a cold resentment began to solidify. He had been the pioneer, the first to set foot on this world, the one who had pacified Alalu and built Eridu from nothing. Now he was being cast aside, his authority stripped, his title made a mockery. As Enlil began laying out the grid for new cities and issuing commands with curt efficiency, Enki gathered his loyal crew and prepared for the long journey south. The fragile unity of the Anunnaki on Earth was over. The planet was now split into two domains, ruled by two rival brothers. In the north, Enlil would build a civilization, and in the south, Enki would dig for gold, his heart hardening with every league that separated him from the brother who had stolen his world. With Enlil's rigid efficiency now driving the Earth mission, the operation transformed. The small scientific outpost of Eridu became the administrative capital of a growing industrial enterprise. Far to the south, in the sweltering heat of the Abzu, Enki's teams had located the mother lode. They had followed the alluvial trails upriver from the sea, deep into the continent, and found the great veins of gold embedded in the ancient rock. The era of sifting through water was over. The age of hard rock mining had begun. Enki's crews, using their advanced tunnelers and laser cutters, burrowed deep into the earth, extracting tons of gold-bearing ore. The mission, at last, was beginning to yield the results Nibiru so desperately needed. But this success created a new, colossal problem of logistics. Getting the gold out of the ground was one thing. Getting it back to Nibiru was another entirely. Earth's gravity, while comfortable enough to live in, was a tyrant when it came to space travel. Launching massive, heavy payloads of gold directly from Earth's surface all the way to Nibiru required an astronomical amount of energy. It was inefficient and unsustainable. Furthermore, Nibiru's vast 3,600-year orbit meant that the optimal launch window for a direct transfer was only open for a very brief period, relatively speaking. They couldn't afford to wait. They needed a cosmic middleman, a celestial warehouse. The solution was the sixth planet in their charts, Mars. The red planet, which they called Lamu, was a perfect way station. Its gravity was a mere third of Earth's, making it vastly easier to launch heavy cargo ships from its surface for the long-haul journey home. The plan was simple. Small, powerful shuttles would act as ferries, lifting the refined gold from Earth to Mars. There, it would be stockpiled until the great cargo ships arrived from Nibiru to pick it up. It was a brilliant, practical solution, but it required a dedicated workforce to run this interplanetary delivery service. This was not a job for the high-ranking Anunnaki lords on Earth. This was a job for the Ikiki. In the complex hierarchy of the Nibirans, the Ikiki were a class unto themselves. The name, which appears in Mesopotamian texts like the Epic of Atrahasis, is often translated as the Watchers or those who observe. They were a younger generation of Anunnaki, the astronauts and pilots who crewed the great starships. They were not the royalty or the high command. They were the skilled blue-collar workers of the space program. 300 of them were assigned to the Mars mission. Their task was to build and operate the way station on Mars and to pilot the shuttlecraft between the two planets. It was a vital, essential role. And it was also a deeply thankless one. Life on Mars was a monotonous cycle of work in a desolate, alien environment. Scientists today understand the immense challenges of a Martian colony. The thin, unbreathable atmosphere, the crushing cold, the constant bombardment of solar radiation, and the fine, pervasive red dust that gets into everything. The Ikiki overcame these challenges by building their base, which they named Lamu, underground. It was a sterile, functional place of corridors and hangars, a glorified truck stop on the cosmic highway. Their job was a dangerous, repetitive grind. They would take off from Mars, navigate to Earth, and perform a harrowing atmospheric entry to land at Enlil's newly built spaceport at Sipar. After taking on a cargo of refined gold, they would launch back out of Earth's heavy gravity and return to their red, dusty home, where they would oversee the unloading and storage of their precious cargo. Then they would do it all over again. They were the long-haul truckers of the solar system. Their only reward, a lonely view of the beautiful blue marble hanging in their sky. A world so close, yet one they were forbidden to set foot on without orders. A rigid social structure was now firmly in place. On Nibiru, the council and the king made the grand strategy. On Earth, the Anunnaki nobility, the sons of Anu and their chief officers, lived as lords, overseeing the vast mining operation and building a new civilization for themselves. And in the cold, sterile bases on Mars and in the cramped cockpits of the shuttle fleet, the Igigi did the hard, dangerous labor of keeping the whole enterprise running. For decades, the system worked. The gold flowed from the mines of the Abzu up to the spaceport at Sipar, across the void to the storehouses of Mars, and finally, on the great cargo vessels, back to the fading atmosphere of Nibiru. Enlil's mission was a resounding success, but he, in his grand administrative headquarters, was insulated from the growing discontent of the workers upon whose backs his success was built. The Anunnaki on Earth had traded the dying crimson twilight of Nibiru for the vibrant living world of Earth. The Igigi had simply traded it for a sterile, underground existence on a dead planet. And as they watched that beautiful, forbidden world spin in the darkness, their patience began to wear as thin as the Martian air. While the Igigi endured the sterile loneliness of Mars, another, larger group of Anunnaki faced a different kind of hell. Down in the sweltering, primordial landscapes of the Abzu, on the continent that would one day be called Africa, the real work of saving Nibiru was being done, and it was brutal. Under the reluctant command of the exiled Enki, thousands of rank-and-file Anunnaki toiled in the deep mines. Their existence was a world away from the comfortable, civilized cities their commander Enlil was busy erecting in Mesopotamia. There were no soaring ziggurats or pleasant canals here. There were only functional, grim mining camps, choking red dust, and the crushing, oppressive heat. Their lives were a cycle of long, grueling shifts in the suffocating darkness of the Earth's crust. The roar of the great tunnel-boring machines was a constant, deafening thunder. The air was thick with pulverized rock and the metallic tang of their laser cutters, a toxic cocktail that clung to their skin and coated their lungs. This was not the glorious mission they had been promised. They were not pioneers or explorers. They were laborers, cogs in a vast industrial machine. For decades, they endured it. They burrowed deeper, chasing the shimmering veins of gold through the unyielding rock. They loaded the ore onto the great haulers that carried it to the refineries. They watched as the purified ingots were loaded onto the shuttles bound for Sipar and then for Mars, a celestial fortune they would never share. All the while, reports trickled in from the Eden, the land of Enlil. They heard of the new cities being built. Nippur, the mission control center. Lhasa, the city of light. Shurupak, the city of healing. They heard of the gardens and the temples, the comfortable lives of the administrators and officers who managed the flow of the gold they were breaking their backs to produce. And a deep, burning resentment began to take root in the dust of the mines. They were being treated like a lower class, their sacrifice taken for granted by a distant, comfortable elite. Enki, their on-site commander, was caught in the middle. He was a lord, one of the royal sons, but he shared their exile and their hardships. He understood their grievances because he saw their suffering firsthand. He argued with his brother via long-distance transmissions, pleading for shorter tours of duty, better conditions, more support. But Enlil, from his command center in Nippur, was unmoved. The quotas were the only thing that mattered. The survival of Nibiru depended on the steady flow of gold, and nothing, certainly not the comfort of the workers, could be allowed to interfere with it. The pressure from Enlil was immense, and Enki had no choice but to push his miners harder. And so, the breaking point finally came. It began in the deepest, hottest shafts of a mine in a region that would one day be known as Eswatini. Evidence of mining in these hills would later be dated by human archaeologists to be at least 40,000 years old, a baffling anomaly for their historical models. But for the Anunnaki, it was simply Sector 7, the richest and most difficult vein yet. After a series of tunnel collapses and equipment failures, the miners of the night shift had had enough. Led by a foreman, they laid down their tools. The word spread like fire through the other sectors, and then to the other mines. The morning shift refused to enter the tunnels. By midday, the entire gold mining operation in the Abzu had ground to a halt. It was a wildcat strike on an interplanetary scale. They were done. They emerged from their barracks, not with weapons, but with the grim faces of beings pushed too far. They marched, thousands strong, to Enki's headquarters, their heavy boots kicking up clouds of red dust. There, in the center of the main compound, they built a massive bonfire and, in a stunning act of collective defiance, began to throw their mining equipment into the flames. Laser drills, helmets, shovels, and harnesses, the very symbols of their servitude, were offered to the fire. It was a declaration of war against the work itself. When news of the rebellion reached Enlil, his fury was absolute. This was mutiny, plain and simple. He immediately flew to the Abzu in his command craft, intending to arrest the ringleaders and force the others back to work at spear point if necessary. He descended from his skyship, expecting to find a disorganized rabble. Instead, he was met by the sight of thousands of his own people standing in silent, unified defiance around a raging inferno of their own tools. His brother Enki stood before them, not as a commander who had lost control, but as a shield, a lone figure caught between the wrath of the heavens and the anger of the earth. "They will work no more," Enki said, his voice heavy with resignation. Enlil stared at the angry, soot-stained faces, illuminated by the flickering light of the fire. The mission was in jeopardy, and for the first time, the Lord of the Command had no orders that anyone would obey. The fire of burning tools crackled and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows across the grim faces of the mutineers. Enlil, the Lord of the Command, stood frozen in a rare state of impotence. His authority, the very core of his being, had evaporated in the face of this united defiance. He could not execute them all, and his threats were met with stony silence. The great Anunaki gold mission, the salvation of a planet, had been brought to its knees by what was essentially a labor dispute. Defeated, Enlil and a deeply troubled Enki retreated to the main command center for the most difficult long-distance call of their lives. The shimmering image of their father, King Anu, materialized in the communication chamber, his face already etched with concern. The news that the gold shipments had ceased had reached Nibiru, and he was not pleased. A bitter and undignified argument immediately erupted between the brothers. "This is the result of your weak leadership," Enlil accused Enki. "You let their grievances fester until it turned to mutiny." Enki shot back, his voice tight with anger. "If you had ever left your comfortable throne in Eden and seen the conditions they were working in, you would have known this was coming. You demanded more and more, and this is the price." Anu silenced them both with a sharp command. Recriminations were useless. They needed a solution, and they needed it now. The council on Nibiru had been convened, and they were all listening. One by one, they considered and discarded their options. Could they replace the striking miners with a new workforce from Nibiru? Impossible. It would take too long. And their homeworld, with its dwindling population, could not spare thousands of able-bodied citizens for a mining colony. Could they fully automate the mines? Enki explained that this too was impossible. The geology of the Abzu was too complex. The laser borers and cutters needed constant, sentient adjustment to follow the unpredictable veins of gold. They were at a complete and utter dead end. The Anunnaki were unwilling to do the work, and no other workers existed. It was into this hopeless silence that Enki dropped his bombshell. "The Anunnaki are unwilling to do the work," he began, his voice quiet but firm. "So, we must create a worker that is." He paused, letting the impossible statement hang in the air. Enlil stared at him, aghast. But before he could object, Enki continued, turning his gaze to a third person in the room, someone who had remained silent until now. She was their half-sister, the mission's chief medical officer and a geneticist of unparalleled genius. Her name was Ninhursag, though she was also known by the honorifics Ninti, the Lady of the Rib, and Mami, a name that simply meant mother. In the Sumerian myths, that would one day be a faint echo of this moment. It was she, the mother goddess, who would help create mankind. Ninhursag listened, her intelligent eyes fixed on Enki, her expression unreadable. "For months," Enki explained, "I have been observing the native life forms of the Abzu. There is one creature in particular that is promising." He brought up images on the main screen. They showed a species of upright, bipedal hominid wandering the African savanna in small groups. They were hairy, with sloping brows and powerful limbs, but they were clever. They used primitive tools of bone and stone. They communicated with a complex series of grunts and calls, and they had a rudimentary social structure. "They are strong," Enki said. "They are acclimated to the planet, and their genetic structure is surprisingly compatible with our own." The implication was clear, but Enki spelled it out anyway. "With your expertise, Ninhursag," he said, "we can take the essence of this creature and improve it. We can take our own genetic code and use it to jumpstart their evolution. We can fashion them in our image, making them stronger, more dexterous, and intelligent enough to understand our commands and operate our machinery." He proposed to create a hybrid, a biological machine designed for one purpose: to take over the toil in the mines. He would call it the Lulu Amalu, the primitive worker, Enlil exploded in outrage. This is madness, an abomination. You are talking about creating monsters, slaves of our own making. He argued that the risks were incalculable. What if these new creatures grew too intelligent? What if they turned on their masters? To mix their own divine essence with that of a beast of the field was, to him, a blasphemous act that would lead to certain disaster. The debate raged, with Anu and the council on Nibiru listening in stunned silence. Enlil argued for order, for purity, for the risks of unintended consequences. Enki argued for a pragmatic, scientific solution to an existential problem. Finally, all eyes turned to Ninhursag, the one being whose expertise could make this insane proposal a reality. The science is possible, she said slowly, her mind already racing through the genetic sequences, the challenge of it all, clearly intriguing her. But the ethics, that is for you, lords, to decide. The choice fell to Anu. On one hand, a paralyzed mission and the certain death of his homeworld. On the other, a monstrous ethical gamble that would forever alter the course of two species and create life for the sole purpose of servitude. Across the gulf of space, the old king weighed the fate of his planet against the soul of his people. The voice of King Anu crackled across the immense distance from Nibiru, each word laden with the weight of a world's survival. There was a long, static-filled pause after Enki's proposal, a silence in which the fate of the earth was decided. When Anu spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. The survival of Nibiru is the paramount law, he decreed. The mission cannot fail. He gave his consent. It was not a joyous or proud command, but a grim necessity. He charged Enki and Ninhursag to proceed with the utmost caution, warning them that they were now the custodians of a fire they might not be able to control. Enlil was ordered to provide whatever resources they needed and to not interfere. The Lord of the Command accepted the order with a curt nod, but his silence was a thunderous protest. The project was on. The creation of the Lulu, the primitive worker, could begin. A special facility was constructed, away from the main settlements. It was a laboratory of life, a place they called the Shimti, in their language, the house where the wind of life is breathed. It was a sterile, quiet place, filled with the gentle hum of atmospheric controls and the soft glow of advanced biological equipment. Here, Enki the scientist and Ninhursag the geneticist, the two architects of a new species, began their momentous work. First, they needed their raw materials. Enki dispatched a team to the Absu, not with mining tools, but with nets and tranquilizer darts. They returned with several captive specimens of the wild, ape-like hominids Enki had observed, confused and terrified creatures who were now unwitting participants in their own evolutionary leap. Next, they needed the divine element, the Anunnaki essence that would provide the genetic upgrade. The ancient Sumerian accounts of this moment, particularly in the epic of Atrahasis, speak of the gods slaying one of their own and mixing his flesh and blood with clay. The reality was less brutal, but just as profound. They selected a young Anunaki, a being with the right genetic markers, and from him they drew blood and tissue samples. His life was not taken, but his biological essence, his spirit, as the myths would remember it, was to be the template for the new being's intelligence and ability to comprehend. Then came the hard part. In the sterile quiet of the Shimti, Ninhursag began the delicate, frustrating work of splicing the two genetic codes. The task was infinitely more complex than they had imagined. She would purify the hominid ovum, introduce the Anunnaki genetic markers, and place the resulting embryo in an artificial crystal womb. The first results were horrifying failures. One attempt produced a creature with deformed limbs, another, a being that could not breathe the planet's air. The process was a heartbreaking series of trial and error, a montage of monstrous mistakes that were quietly and compassionately euthanized. Some of the early rejects looked like the stuff of nightmares, and it's a bit of a wonder they didn't just call it a day and decide that manual labor wasn't so bad after all. Ninhursag grew frustrated, Enki grew anxious, and Enlil, receiving the daily reports, grew ever more certain that the entire project was a cursed folly. After countless failures, Ninhursag had a realization. The artificial wombs were not working. The complex biological signaling of a living mother was a necessary component. The hybrid embryo needed to be carried to term inside a living host. It was a risk she had been unwilling to take, but now it was the only option left. A call went out for female Anunnaki volunteers to act as surrogate mothers for a species not yet born. It was Ninhursag herself, the great mother goddess of future myths, who was the first to step forward. She would be the vessel. With meticulous care, she prepared the next hybrid ovum, a perfected sequence that she believed had corrected all the previous errors. She implanted it within herself. And then they waited. The gestation period was tense. Every scan, every vital sign was monitored with breathless anticipation. Finally, the day came. In the delivery room of the Shimti, surrounded by Enki and her medical staff, Ninhursag gave birth. The cry of the newborn was strong and clear. It was a success. Ninhursag held the child up, her face a mixture of exhaustion and pure, unadulterated triumph. "I have created it," she cried out, her voice echoing the words that would be recorded in human myths for millennia. "My hands have made it." The child was a male. They looked at him in awe. He had the dark, reddish skin of the native hominids, the clay of the Abzu, but his form was refined. His brow was higher, his limbs were straighter, and his eyes, as they blinked open, held a spark of comprehension, of awareness that was absent in his wild cousins. He was a perfect fusion, a being of earth, elevated by the essence of the stars. They named him Adamu, one of the earth. He was the first human. With the genetic template now proven, Ninhursag enlisted 13 other female Anunnaki to serve as surrogates. Soon, the Shimti was filled with the cries of newborns, 7 male and 7 female primitive workers. The solution to the Anunnaki's labor problem was alive and breathing. But as Enki looked at the face of the infant Adamu, a creature made in his own image, a disturbing and unfamiliar emotion stirred within him. It was more than the pride of an inventor. It was the protective instinct of a father, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that this was a complication that no one, not even he, had planned for. The success of the Lulu project was immediate and profound. The first generation of primitive workers, strong and adaptable, were put through a rigorous on-the-job training program in the minds of the Abzu. They learned quickly, their minds, designed by Enki and Ninhursag, to grasp complex but repetitive tasks. The Anunnaki miners, who had been on the brink of open civil war, were reassigned to supervisory roles, becoming foremen and overseers. For the first time in decades, they were relieved of the backbreaking toil. The mood in the camps lifted, and more importantly, the flow of gold to Nibiru resumed, now in greater quantities than ever before. Enlil, from his command center in Nippur, had to admit that his brother's monstrous solution was, from a purely logistical standpoint, a spectacular success. But this initial batch of workers, created through the sacrifice of Anunnaki surrogate mothers, was finite. To create a truly sustainable workforce, a second act of creation was required. Enki and Ninhursag went back to their laboratories and performed one final genetic adjustment, tweaking the workers' biology to allow them to procreate. With this new gift of fertility, the human race was now self-perpetuating. Their numbers began to swell, a burgeoning population of servants born to serve the gods from the sky. Among all these new beings, one was special. He was Adamu, the very first of his kind, the one Ninhursag herself had carried. As he grew, it became clear that he was different from the others. He possessed a level of intelligence and a depth of curiosity that far surpassed his intended design. He was Enki's prototype, his Model One, and in him, Enki saw the full, unintended potential of his creation. That paternal affection Enki had felt at Adamu's birth had only deepened. He could not bring himself to see this remarkable being as a mere beast of burden. And so, Enki broke the rules. He brought Adamu out of the rough mining camps of the Abzu and into his own city, Eridu, the first and most sacred city on earth. There, Enki began to treat him not as a servant, but as a son and a student. In the quiet halls of his temple, away from the prying eyes of the other Anunnaki, Enki undertook a secret and forbidden tutelage. The Lulu had been designed to understand commands, but Enki taught Adamu language, the complex grammar and script of the Anunnaki. The Lulu had been designed to operate machinery, but Enki taught Adamu mathematics and the fundamentals of engineering. He took him to the top of the ziggurat at night and taught him astronomy, showing him Nibiru as a faint, distant star and explaining the cosmic mechanics of their worlds. He gave him the most forbidden knowledge of all, the truth. He told Adamu who the Anunnaki were, why they were on Earth, and how he, Adamu, had been created. This secret education is the likely origin of the ancient Mesopotamian tale known as the myth of Adapa. In that story, which has puzzled scholars for centuries, a mortal man named Adapa, a sage from Eridu, is granted supreme wisdom by his creator god, Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, but is ultimately denied immortality. The myth was a fragmented memory of this very real relationship between a god and his favorite creation. It was, of course, a secret that could not be kept forever. During an inspection tour of Eridu, Enlil overheard Adamu speaking with Enki, not as a servant taking orders, but as a student discussing a complex matter. The Lord of the Command was speechless with fury. He stormed into Enki's chambers and confronted his brother, his voice shaking with rage. "What is the meaning of this? You have taught it to speak our tongue, To read our charts, he demanded. I created a worker, as I was instructed. Enki replied calmly. But I also created a person. He has a mind, and it is a crime to let such a mind go to waste. Enlil saw this not as education, but as the ultimate act of rebellion. You have contaminated the project. You were told to create a simple beast, and instead, you have made it in our image, given it our knowledge. You have elevated a slave to the level of a god. The argument was so venomous, so fundamental to the future of the mission, that the matter was escalated to the highest possible authority. King Anu on Nibiru was informed of what Enki had done. He too was gravely concerned by the unforeseen development. A decision was made. Anu would see this elevated creature for himself. Adamu, the first human, was to be brought to Nibiru to stand before the throne of the king of the gods. For Adamu, the news was terrifying. He was to board a skyship, a Shem, and travel through the heavens to the homeworld of his creators. Enki spent days preparing him for the ordeal. He coached him on the intricate protocols of the royal court, how to bow before Anu, how to speak with deference, and he gave him one final, critical warning. When you are on Nibiru, Enki instructed, his hands on his students' shoulders, they will offer you the bread of life and the water of life. You must not partake of them. They will be a test. It is the bread of death you will be eating, the water of death you will be drinking. With this cryptic advice, Enki sent his creation, his son, on the most incredible journey imaginable. The fate of his new species and his own life now rested on how he conducted himself in the court of the cosmic king. The journey through the void was a terrifying, silent eternity for Adamu. He, who had known only the soil and sky of earth, was now a passenger in a vessel of the gods, watching his homeworld shrink to a beautiful blue star. When he arrived at Nibiru, the home of his creators, the shock was profound. The sky was not blue, but a deep, bruised crimson, and the light from their distant red sun was thin and weak. Yet beneath this dying sky stood cities of impossible scale and geometric perfection, glowing with a soft internal light. He was brought through streets, walked by giants, his creators, and into a throne room so vast it seemed to hold the sky itself. There, seated on a throne of incandescent crystal, was Anu, the great king, his face ancient and lined with the worries of a dying world. Anu looked down at the small, dark-skinned being from the seventh planet, and he was both impressed and deeply alarmed. Adamu spoke their language fluently. He answered the king's questions about Earth's flora and fauna with a scientist's precision. He understood complex concepts. This was no beast of burden. This was a mind, a spirit, trapped in a mortal form. Enki had not just created a worker. He had created a new kind of son. Seeing the potential, and perhaps seeking to undermine Enki's influence over the new species, Anu made a grand pronouncement. He would undo the curse of Adamu's mortal design. He offered him a place among the Anunnaki. Servants brought forth a gleaming tray. On it was the bread of life, and a chalice containing the water of life. Partake of this, Adamu, the king said, his voice echoing in the great hall, and you shall live forever, as we do. Adamu's heart pounded in his chest. Immortality, the ultimate gift. But Enki's final, desperate warning echoed in his ears. It is the bread of death you will be eating. Who should he trust? the king of the universe, or the father who had shaped him. In a choice that would seal the fate of his species, Adamu chose his father. He bowed his head low and politely, humbly, refused the king's gift. Anu was flabbergasted, then furious, not at Adamu, but at Enki. He understood at once. Enki had deliberately lied to his creation, ensuring he would refuse the gift of immortality, thereby keeping humanity bound to the earth and to him. It was a stunning act of paternal jealousy and control. Robbed of his grand gesture, Anu passed his final judgment. Adamu would return to earth. He would be granted a long life and great status as the first priest king, the intermediary between humans and their gods. But he and his descendants would remain mortal, and so the ancient myth was fulfilled. Wisdom was given, but eternal life was withheld. Adamu's return to earth was a momentous event. He was a legend, the man who had walked in the heavens and spoken to the great Anu. He established a line of priest kings, conveying the will of the Anunnaki to the growing human population. His very existence fundamentally changed the perception of humanity. They were no longer just tools or livestock. They were intelligent. They were capable of great wisdom. And as their population expanded across the lands of Mesopotamia and the Abzu, the Anunnaki males began to notice something else entirely. The daughters of men were beautiful. A new, unforeseen complication was introduced into the Earth mission: loneliness. Many of the rank and file Anunnaki had been on Earth for centuries. Their tours of duty were long, and Nibiru was a world away. They worked and lived alongside these new humans, and the line between master and servant began to blur. The inevitable happened. What likely started as secret affairs in the mining camps or distant settlements soon became more open. Anunnaki males, including many of the Igigi, who were now stationed on Earth, began taking human women as wives. This development was recorded with startling clarity in the historical and religious texts of humanity, most famously in the book of Genesis, chapter 6. And it came to pass that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. These were not metaphorical unions. They were the breaking of a profound taboo. And from these unions came children, a new generation of hybrids who were neither fully human nor fully Anunnaki. They were taller, stronger, and lived longer than their human mothers, but were mortal unlike their divine fathers. They were the demigods of myth, the mighty men which were of old, men of renown. This was the final straw for Enlil. His brother had already created a new species against his advice. Now, his own people were polluting their sacred bloodline by interbreeding with them. He saw the situation on Earth as a chaotic, corrupting mess. The planet was teeming with a proliferating human race that was growing louder and more troublesome by the day. And now, it was being overrun by a bastard race of hybrids. From his seat of command in Nippur, he looked upon the world he was supposed to be managing and was filled with a cold, righteous disgust. The entire experiment, he concluded, had been a catastrophic failure, and a failure of this magnitude required a solution of equal scale. The return of Adamu from the heavens marked a turning point on Earth, and for Enlil, it was a turn for the worse. The once clear line between master and servant had been irrevocably blurred. The beings that were meant to be silent, unthinking tools were now a civilization in their own right, with priest kings, rituals, and a growing sense of self-awareness. Their population, no longer limited by the slow process of Anunnaki surrogacy, exploded. Human settlements spread across the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, their numbers swelling from hundreds to thousands, and then to tens of thousands. And with this proliferation of life came something Enlil, the Lord of the Command, found utterly intolerable: noise. His grand city of Nippur was meant to be the serene, orderly command center for the entire planet. From its central ziggurat, he managed supply lines, shipping schedules, and communications with Nibiru. It was supposed to be a place of quiet efficiency. But now, a constant, irritating clamor rose from the human settlements that surrounded his cities. It was the sound of life itself, and he hated it. It was the shouting of children, the braying of domesticated animals, the hammering and chatter of their endless construction, the music from their primitive festivals. This cacophony, a ceaseless hum of unruly existence, grated on his nerves. The ancient epic of Atrahasis, one of humanity's oldest stories, records Enlil's complaint with startling simplicity. The noise of mankind had become so great that he could not sleep. It was the complaint of a god who had become the grumpy neighbor to an entire species, a being of perfect order, forced to live above a party that never ended. This noise was more than a mere annoyance. It was a symptom of the deeper chaos his brother had unleashed. He saw the corruption everywhere. He saw his Anunnaki officers, who were supposed to be focused on the mission, sneaking off to visit their human wives and hybrid children. He saw these half-breed children, who belonged to no clear social class, causing trouble in the settlements, a constant, messy reminder of a broken taboo. He saw the planet's resources, food, water, land, being consumed by a species that contributed nothing but labor and noise. In Enlil's mind, the primitive workers were a bug in the system that had now become a virus, threatening to overwhelm the entire operating system of his world. His first instinct was not total annihilation, but population control. He decided to thin the herd. He went to his medical officers and commanded them to create a plague, a sickness that would sweep through the human settlements and drastically reduce their numbers. The sickness was released, and humanity began to suffer. But Enlil had once again underestimated his brother's affection for his creations. Enki, from his city of Eridu, saw the plague for what it was: an attack. He would not let his children be wiped out. He secretly made contact with the human priest kings, the successors to Adapa. He gave them divine instructions, not revealing the source of the plague, but telling them how to combat it. He dictated rules of hygiene, of boiling water, of quarantining the sick. It was the world's first public health initiative, a divine intervention of sanitation. And it worked. The plague subsided. Humanity recovered, and with their newfound resilience, began to multiply even faster. Enlil was furious. He tried again, this time engineering a drought by manipulating the weather patterns, holding back the rains that fed the Tigris and Euphrates. And again, Enki intervened, teaching the humans how to dig deep wells and create intricate irrigation canals to bring water from the sea. turning arid plains into fertile farmland. Each of Enlil's attempts to cull the population was thwarted by his brother's secret, benevolent meddling. This was the ultimate betrayal. Enlil now saw Enki not just as an irresponsible scientist, but as a saboteur who was actively undermining the commander's authority and protecting his flawed pets at the expense of cosmic order. The problem was not just that humanity was loud and unruly. It was that they had a protector in the house of the gods itself. Enlil realized that half measures would never work as long as Enki was there to counter them. A permanent solution was required. A final solution. His rage solidified into a cold, calculated resolve. He would not just punish humanity, he would erase it. He would wipe the slate of this planet clean, scour it of the humans, the hybrids, the noise, the chaos, and all evidence of his brother's catastrophic mistake. He wanted to perform a factory reset on the entire world. And so he began to search for a weapon, a force so vast and indiscriminate that not even Enki could stop it. He commanded his astronomers to study the heavens, to calculate the trajectory of Nibiru's next passage. And they brought him the very news he was hoping for. The next crossing was imminent, and it would bring with it a cataclysm of unimaginable power, a great global flood. For Enlil, this was not a looming disaster. It was a divine instrument, a heaven-sent opportunity to finally get some peace and quiet. Armed with the certainty of a coming cosmic event, Enlil's plan shifted from bitter fantasy to cold, hard strategy. He was no longer just a frustrated commander complaining about noise. He was a strategist with a weapon of unimaginable power, handed to him by the universe itself. He called a full assembly of the Anunnaki Council on Earth, patching in a secure, real-time channel to King Anu and the elders on Nibiru. He didn't open the meeting with a tirade about the failings of humanity. Instead, he began with a calm, terrifyingly rational, scientific presentation, complete with holographic star charts and geophysical simulations. It was the most effective doomsday PowerPoint in history. He laid out the undeniable facts. Nibiru's trajectory was set. Its perigee, its closest approach to the inner solar system, would bring it near Earth. The gravitational forces exerted by their massive homeworld would be immense, and his scientists had calculated the precise effect. The vast sheet of ice that had accumulated over the planet's southern pole for millennia would be destabilized. It would slip from its continental anchor and crash into the sea. The resulting displacement would trigger a tidal wave of continental scale, a global deluge that would scour every landmass on the planet. This, Enlil concluded with grim satisfaction, was not a theory. It was a celestial certainty. Having established the inevitability of the catastrophe, Enlil then presented his masterfully simple proposal. "We did not cause this," he argued, his voice resonating with cold logic. "It is a natural consequence of the cosmic cycles. Our only responsibility is to ensure the survival of our own people and the security of our mission." His plan was one of deliberate, calculated inaction. The Anunnaki, he proposed, would quietly prepare for the event. On the appointed day, they would all retreat to their spacecraft, ascend into orbit, and wait for the flood to pass. They would simply ride out the storm from a safe distance. And the humans? They would not be warned. The gods would simply vanish into the sky one day. leaving their creations to face the coming tide in blissful ignorance. He was not proposing to kill them. He was proposing that they let them die. It was a fine distinction, a legalistic loophole that allowed for genocide without the messy business of pulling the trigger. Enki, listening to his brother's clinical proposal for the end of the world, was beside himself with rage. He rose to his feet, his usual calm demeanor shattered. "A natural event," he roared, his voice shaking. "We have weather satellites that can predict a rainstorm a week in advance. And you want to pretend we have no responsibility for a cataclysm we can foresee years ahead. This is not inaction. It is a death sentence delivered by silence." He turned his appeal to Anu and the other council members. "They are our creation, our children. Yes, they are troublesome. Yes, they are loud. But they are alive, and they are ours. To abandon them is to murder them. It is an act unworthy of our people, a stain on our honor that will never wash away." The debate was fierce. Ninhursag, the mother of the Adamu, wept at the thought of her creations being wiped from the face of the earth. But others on the council were swayed. The Earth mission had become a long, complicated, and messy affair. The allure of a clean slate, a chance to start over without the complications of a burgeoning native population, was undeniably tempting. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of great flood myths in nearly every ancient culture, from the Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh to the Hindu story of Manu and the biblical account of Noah, points to a single, global event, or simply a common human fear of river floods. But in the council of the gods, the flood was a very real and present danger. The decision, as always, fell to the king. Anu had listened to his son's passionate arguments, one from the head, the other from the heart. As a king, his primary duty was to his own people and their survival. The human experiment had been a solution to a labor crisis, but it had spiraled out of control. Enlil's cold, pragmatic argument won the day. The official policy was set. The Anunnaki would save themselves, and only themselves. Humanity would be left to its fate, to ensure there would be no more meddling from his soft-hearted brother. Enlil insisted on one final binding measure. Every single member of the council, every Anunnaki present, must swear a solemn and unbreakable oath. They had to swear on the life of Nibiru itself, that they would not reveal the coming deluge to a single human soul. One by one, the council members took the oath. Ninhursag took it through her tears. And finally, Enki, cornered and outmaneuvered, was forced to swear as well. His hands were tied. His voice was silenced by a sacred vow he could not break. The meeting adjourned. The fate of the world was sealed. Enlil had won. As Enki walked from the silent council chamber, his heart was a cold knot of despair. He was a god, a creator, and he had just been forced to promise that he would stand by and watch his own children drown. The days following the Great Council's decision were a time of quiet, gnawing agony for Enki. He was bound by a sacred oath, a vow sworn on the very life of his homeworld. He, the creator, was condemned to be a silent witness to the annihilation of his own creations. In the cities of the Eden, the Anunnaki began their discreet preparations. Vital equipment was dismantled. Essential records were loaded onto data crystals. and the great skyships were brought to a state of full readiness. It was all done under the guise of routine maintenance and cargo rotation, a silent, coordinated exodus that the teeming human population never even noticed. To them, the gods were merely busy, as they often were. Enki watched it all from his temple in Eridu, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He spent his nights pacing the ziggurat, looking at the stars, trapped in an ethical prison of his own brother's design. To break his oath would be to invite personal ruin and the wrath of the entire Anunnaki establishment. To keep it would be to betray every living soul he had brought into being. But Enki was the god of wisdom, cunning, and the deep. He was a master of finding the currents beneath the surface, the loopholes in the law. An oath was a thing of words, and words, he knew, had flexibility. He pored over the precise wording of the vow he had been forced to take. I will not reveal the council's decision to a single human. The wording was absolute. He could not speak to a human, but he reasoned with the skill of a divine lawyer, meticulously reading the terms and conditions. The oath said nothing about speaking near a human. It said nothing about talking to inanimate objects. It was a flimsy, transparent loophole, but it was enough. He would not break his oath. He would simply bend it until it screamed. Now he needed to choose who to save. He couldn't save everyone, but he could preserve the seed. He scanned the cities of Mesopotamia, his gaze passing over the kings and the warriors. He needed someone who would not question a strange divine command, someone whose faith in his creator was absolute. His choice fell upon the ruler of the city of Shurupak, a man renowned for his gentleness and piety. His Sumerian name was Ziusudra. He was the man who would be remembered in the epics of Babylon as Utnapishtim, and whose story, passed down through the generations, would form the basis for the tale of a man named Noah. Ziusudra was Enki's most devoted servant, a man who began and ended every day with prayers to his patron god. He was the one. Under the cover of a moonless night, Enki traveled by skimmer to Shurupak. He did not announce his presence. He did not knock on Ziusudra's door. Instead, he went to the back of the man's modest dwelling, a simple house made, as many were, of woven reeds plastered with clay. He knew that Ziusudra's bed was just on the other side of that thin wall. Placing his hand on the reeds as if to steady himself, Enki took a deep breath. He was not speaking to Ziusudra. He was speaking to the hut. Reed hut, reed hut, wall, oh wall, he whispered, his voice low but carrying a strange, resonant power. Listen, reed hut, and pay heed, oh wall. Inside, Ziusudra was stirred from his sleep. He sat up, believing a dream was upon him, for the voice of his god, Enki, was filling his mind, clear as a bell. Enki, speaking to the wall, laid out his terrible and urgent instructions. A flood will sweep over the land, the voice in the dream said. It will be a deluge of utter destruction, the end of all things. Listen to my words, for this is your only hope. Tear down this house, this flimsy thing of reeds, and in its place, build a boat. Forget all your worldly possessions, and build a vessel that will save your life. Enki then gave the hut a series of precise and bizarre instructions. The boat was not to be a normal ship, open to the sky. It was to be a sealed chest, a submersible vessel that could withstand a torrent from above as well as the churning sea below. He gave its exact dimensions, dictated its 7-decked interior, and commanded that its hull be waterproofed, inside and out, with layers of bitumen and pitch. When the time comes, Enki continued, his voice urgent, you will bring aboard your family, but you must also bring the seed of all living things. He, he explained how to gather and preserve the life essence of the creatures of the field and the birds of the air, a task made simpler by the advanced biological knowledge he imparted. He also told him to bring aboard the most skilled craftsmen he could find, so that the arts of civilization would not be lost. Ziusudra awoke in a cold sweat. The dream message seared into his memory. He did not question it. The command from his god was absolute. The next morning, he began his work, announcing to the bewildered citizens of Shurupak that he was tearing down his home to build a gigantic, box-like boat. His neighbors mocked him, but Ziusudra, his face set with grim purpose, paid them no mind. He had a world to save. In the city of Shurupak, a strange madness seemed to have gripped its ruler. Ziusudra, a man once respected for his sober piety, now worked with a frantic, feverish energy. He and his family, along with a handful of the city's finest craftsmen who trusted his divine vision, labored day and night on the bizarre, monstrous vessel he was building in the town square. It was an object of public ridicule, a giant wooden box sealed with black pitch that looked more like a floating coffin than a seafaring ship. As the days ticked by, a strange quiet began to settle over the land. The Anunnaki, the gods who had been a constant, looming presence for centuries, seemed to vanish. Their skyships no longer crisscrossed the heavens, and their commanding voices no longer issued decrees from the temples. To the masses of humanity, it was a strange but welcome respite. To Ziusudra, it was a terrifying sign that his god's prophecy was about to come true. On the day Enki had foretold in the dream, Ziusudra gathered his family, the craftsmen, and the precious collection of life's essences he had been commanded to collect. He herded the last of his chosen animals up the great ramp, and then, with the sky beginning to take on a strange, metallic sheen, he sealed the main hatch from the inside, plunging his tiny world into a cavernous, expectant darkness. The storm began, not with a thunderclap, but with an unnerving, howling wind that tore across the plains. The sky turned from gray to a bruised, sickening purple-black. And then the rain began. It was not a rain that Earth had ever known before, a solid, roaring sheet of water that fell with such force it felt like the sky itself was collapsing. But the true terror did not come from above. From their safe vantage point in orbit, the Anunnaki fleet watched the cataclysm unfold. They saw the great southern ice cap, a continent of frozen water, groan and shudder under Nibiru's gravitational pull. Then, in a silent, horrifying spectacle, it slid into the ocean. The effect was almost instantaneous. A colossal wall of water, a wave of impossible height, erupted from the bottom of the world and began to race northwards across the oceans. It was the planet's immune system, rising up to purge a fever. When the wave hit the coast of Mesopotamia, it was a liquid mountain moving at the speed of a skyship. It did not just flood the land, it annihilated it. Cities, temples, fields, and forests vanished in an instant, scoured from the face of the earth by a churning, muddy torrent. Inside his vessel, Ziusudra and his family could only hold on in the terrifying roaring darkness as their ship was lifted and tossed about like a splinter of wood. The screams of their drowning world silenced by the deafening power of the sea. High above the storm, in the silent sterility of their orbiting spacecraft, the gods watched, and their divine composure shattered. The clinical, abstract decision they had made in a council chamber was now a visceral, horrifying reality. They saw their beautiful blue and white jewel of a planet turn into a featureless, brown ball of mud and rage. Their cities, their mines, their magnificent ziggurats, all were erased. Ninhursag, the mother goddess, cried out in anguish, her wails echoing through the cramped command ship. My people, my children, how could I have let this happen? She wept, cursing the day she ever agreed to their creation. All that I have painstakingly brought into being has been turned back to clay. Even Enlil, the architect of this apocalypse, was shaken to his core. The sheer, untamable violence of the flood was more than he had ever imagined. His perfect, orderly solution was a chaotic, ugly, terrifying mess. He stared at the drowning world in stunned silence, his righteous anger replaced by a hollow, sickening awe. The ancient epics say the gods cowered like wet dogs, huddled together in the heavens, terrified of the very destruction they had unleashed. For 6 days and 6 nights, the storm raged. The Anunnaki fleet, their own supplies running low, could do nothing but float in the void and bear witness to the end of the world they had colonized. Geologists in the far future would find evidence of colossal ancient floods in Earth's history. Moments when sea levels rose dramatically, while the idea of a single, global flood would remain controversial. The memory of such devastating regional cataclysms burned into the collective psyche of the survivors could easily have been mythologized into a world-ending event. For the Anunnaki, it was no myth. It was the consequence of their own terrible judgment. As the last of the storm clouds finally began to part, they peered down through the viewport at what was left. The world was gone. In its place was a calm, silent global ocean, with nothing but the highest mountain peaks breaking the surface. Their work, their civilization, and their sin had all been washed away. And in the terrible quiet that followed, only Enki held on to a single, flickering ember of hope, searching the endless waters for a tiny, pitch-blackened boat. For what felt like an eternity, the great sealed boat was a tiny, fragile world of darkness and chaos, tossed upon an endless, angry sea. Then, with a jarring lurch and a final, groaning shudder, it stopped. The terrifying motion ceased, replaced by an unnerving, profound stillness. After waiting a full day and night to be certain, a weary Ziusudra unsealed the main hatch and pushed it open. The light that streamed in was so pure and bright it was almost painful, and the air that filled the vessel was cool, clean, and utterly alien. He stepped out onto the deck and stared in stunned silence. His boat had come to rest on the muddy slope of a colossal mountain, its peak piercing the clouds. All around him, in every direction, was water. A calm, silent, global ocean stretched to the horizon, a mirror reflecting a sky washed clean of its fury. This was all that was left of the world. The mountain, a lonely island in a drowned planet, would be remembered in legend by many names, most famously Ararat or Nisir, the peak of salvation. Overcome with a profound sense of gratitude, Ziusudra gathered his family and built a small, crude altar from the mountain stones. There, he offered a sacrifice to the god who had saved them, sending the smell of roasted lamb, the first scent of renewed life, drifting up into the empty heavens. High in orbit, the scent was a signal, a flicker on their atmospheric sensors, an anomaly of carbon and heat that could only mean one thing: a fire, life. Enki's gambit had worked. A wave of relief washed over the Anunnaki fleet. One by one, their skyships descended through the clouds, their silver hulls gleaming in the new sun. The ancient epics say they gathered like flies around the sacrifice, a telling description of once mighty gods, humbled and starved after their week-long ordeal, drawn to the sight of a single mortal man and his cooking fire. As they landed, Ninhursag rushed forward, her face a mask of joyous, tearful relief. She pointed to the brilliant, multicolored arc of a rainbow that had formed in the misty air, a consequence of the saturated atmosphere, and declared it a sacred covenant. Never again, she vowed, would they seek to destroy the life of their planet. But then, a final, larger ship descended, and from it strode Enlil. He saw Ziusudra's family, the smoking altar, and the great battered ark resting on the mountainside. His face turned to thunder. He knew instantly he had been betrayed. How? He roared, his voice echoing across the silent peak as he advanced on his brother. How did a mortal survive? You gave an oath. Enki stood his ground, unafraid. I did not break my oath, brother, he said calmly. I did not speak to the man. I spoke to a reed wall. It was not my fault the man was clever enough to overhear. But before Enlil's rage could escalate into violence, the other Anunnaki, led by a determined Ninhursag, stepped between them. The trauma of the flood had changed them. Their arrogance had been washed away, replaced by a profound sense of regret and a shared responsibility. There will be no more killing, Ninhursag said, her voice firm. This family is a sign. Life has endured. We will not compound our mistake with another. Enlil looked at the faces of his people, at his weeping sister, at the weary council members, and he saw that he was alone. His perfect, clean solution had been a horrifying, traumatic failure. His will was broken. In a stunning reversal, the great lord of the command walked past his brother, approached the terrified Ziusudra and his wife, and placed his hands upon their heads in a gesture of blessing. He, who had sought to destroy mankind, now rewarded its sole survivor, granting him and his wife greatly prolonged life and a place of honor. In the days that followed, as the waters slowly began to recede, a new policy was forged, not of anger, but of necessity and remorse. The world was a blank slate of mud. The handful of human survivors could not rebuild on their own. The Anunnaki, accepting their role as custodians of the planet they had nearly destroyed, decided to become teachers. The age of exploitation was over. The age of civilization was about to begin. They gathered the small band of survivors and began to bestow upon them the gifts that would allow them to build a new world. They provided them with seeds for new, hardy strains of wheat and barley, teaching them the art of agriculture in the rich, fertile silt the flood had left behind. They gave them domesticated animals, sheep for wool and milk, oxen for plowing, and most importantly, They re-established the framework of society, the concept the Sumerians would call Nam Lugal, or kingship. A new line of human kings, descended from Zeusudra, would be appointed to govern humanity, acting as shepherds for their people and intermediaries for the gods. The Anunnaki would be the teachers, humanity the pupils, and together they would rebuild the world. It was a new dawn, a covenant of hope between creator and creation. But as they planned the first new cities of this post-diluvian age, the old rivalries of the gods, now with new kingdoms of men to rule over, would inevitably begin to surface once more. The waters of the Great Flood receded with agonizing slowness, leaving behind a world transformed, a planet baptized and reborn in mud. The old coastlines were gone. Familiar landscapes were submerged or altered. But in the great river valleys of Mesopotamia, the deluge had left a gift, a thick, impossibly fertile layer of new soil, a blank slate for agriculture and for a new beginning, in a rare and fragile truce born of shared trauma and regret. Enlil and Enki put aside their bitter rivalry to undertake the greatest urban planning project in history. The old model of a single mission headquarters surrounded by a chaotic human population was over. The new strategy, agreed upon by the humbled council, was to create a more orderly and structured world. They would divide the known world into distinct regions, seeding three separate but parallel civilizations, each under the guidance of a different branch of the Anunnaki family. It was, in essence, a divine zoning committee, partitioning the entire planet. The first and most important of these new domains was, naturally, reserved for Enlil and his clan. This was the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the traditional heartland of the Anunnaki on Earth. This region, Mesopotamia, would be the official center of civilization, the first region. Here, the descendants of Zeusudra would be taught to build the great cities that would one day be known as Sumer. A new Nippur would be built to serve as the mission's command and control center. A new Eridu would be re-established as a sacred city of knowledge, and a new spaceport would be constructed at Sipar, the vital link back to Nibiru. This was Enlil's domain, a place of order, temples, and rigid social hierarchies, where his sons, the stoic warrior Ninurta and the thoughtful moon god Nanarsin, would be given their own cities to rule. Kingship, the organizing principle of this new world, would be lowered from heaven first in this region. The second great domain was assigned to Enki and his lineage. While Enlil would control the central territory, Enki's clan was given stewardship over the long, fertile ribbon of land that flanked the great Nile River in the Abzu, the land that would become Egypt. This second region was a world unto itself, protected by deserts and nourished by the predictable rhythm of the great river. It was a perfect place for Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and secret knowledge, to cultivate a different kind of civilization. Here, he and his ambitious firstborn son, Marduk, would guide humanity along a different path, one focused on astronomy, monumental construction, and a more mystical understanding of life and death. The two civilizations, Sumer and Egypt, were thus established as parallel projects, reflections of the very different personalities of the two rival brothers who governed them. A third region was also designated, a distant and mysterious land centered on the Indus River Valley. This third region was assigned to the one Anunnaki who had suffered the most emotionally from the flood, Ninhursag, the mother goddess. She, along with her fierce and ambitious granddaughter Inanna, a goddess who would later be known as Ishtar, was to oversee the development of this territory. It was to be a place of great natural wealth, a civilization that would develop its own unique character, focused on trade and craftsmanship. Human historians would one day be baffled by the near simultaneous emergence of what they called the three great cradles of civilization: Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, each springing into existence with sophisticated agriculture, urban centers, and written language. For the Anunnaki, this was no coincidence. It was the deliberate unfolding of their post-Diluvian master plan. The descendants of Siusudra, known in some traditions as Shem, Ham, and Japheth, were tasked with populating these three new homelands, becoming the progenitors of the distinct peoples who would build Sumer, tame the Nile, and raise the great cities of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. For a time, the plan worked. The fragile truce held. Humanity, grateful for its salvation, worked alongside its divine teachers. The first harvests were gathered, the first bricks of the new cities were laid, and the world slowly began to heal. But by neatly dividing the earth among the different branches of the royal family, the Anunnaki had unwittingly turned the planet into a grand chessboard. They had partitioned the family inheritance among proud and powerful heirs, each with their own ambitions and their own armies of loyal human subjects. The stage was now set for the next generation of gods, the children of Enlil and Enki, to play out their own rivalries. And in this new game of divine politics, the cities, kingdoms, and very lives of mortal men and women would be the pawns. The new world, born from a desire for peace and order, was already being primed for its next great conflict. The new world, partitioned so neatly by the High Command, was meant to be a world of order. But the Anunnaki had not accounted for the ambitions of their own children. While Enlil and Enki settled into their roles as the elder statesmen of Earth, a new generation of gods, born on Nibiru, but raised in the strange gravity and vibrant atmosphere of this new world, began to see the planet not as a mining colony, but as their birthright. And none were more ambitious, more brilliant, and more dangerous than the goddess Inanna. As the great-granddaughter of Anu himself, she was a being of immaculate lineage. But she was not content to rest on her family name. She was the living embodiment of a paradox, the goddess of sensual love and the goddess of brutal warfare. And she was equally adept at both. While she had been granted a domain in the distant third region of the Indus Valley, her eyes were fixed on the heart of power, Mesopotamia. She looked at the new cities rising from the mud, and she wanted one for herself. Not a minor town, but a great capital. She chose the city of Uruk, and she was determined to make it the grandest city in the world. To do this, she needed more than walls, people, and a fancy temple. She needed what every great city of the Anunnaki needed: the Emis. The Emis were not just laws or customs. They were the divine source codes of civilization itself, stored on sacred data crystals. They contained the essential blueprints for over 100 key elements of a high society: the principles of kingship, the duties of the priesthood, the techniques for metallurgy and weaving, the art of the scribe, the knowledge of music and mathematics, the strategies for warfare, and even the subtleties of seduction. They were, in essence, the operating system for a thriving culture, and the entire library of these precious programs was held by one god, the wise, ancient, and deeply protective Enki, in his sacred city of Eridu. Inanna knew that a direct request would be denied, and a military assault on the city of the god who saved humanity was unthinkable. She would need to use a different set of weapons. It was time for a hostile takeover, divine, feminine style. She prepared herself not for battle, but for a state visit. She adorned herself in her most alluring garments, her eyes painted with kohl, her scent a mesmerizing blend of exotic perfumes. She boarded her magar, her boat of heaven, and set a course for Eridu. Enki, the old scientist, was delighted to be visited by his brilliant and beautiful young grandniece was a welcome distraction from the slow, methodical work of rebuilding the world. He ordered a great feast to be prepared in her honor, with the finest wines and strongest ales the new world had to offer. The two gods sat in Enki's great hall, feasting and talking. Inanna, with practiced skill, steered the conversation to Enki's accomplishments, praising his wisdom, his creations, his role in their survival. All the while, she challenged him to drink, her own cup seemingly bottomless, while his was constantly refilled. The old god, his judgment clouded by pride and a truly heroic amount of alcohol, grew boastful. "You admire my city, my dear," he slurred, gesturing expansively. "It is great only because I have the Emmys." Seeing her opening, Inanna feigned a deep, covetous admiration. Enki, in a fit of drunken generosity, decided to grant his favorite girl a few party favors. "You like the high priesthood," he declared. "It is yours, a gift." He handed her the crystal. "What about the art of the hero, the skill of power? Also yours." One by one, he drunkenly gifted her the sacred trusts of civilization. She accepted each one with a gracious smile, all while her pilot was discreetly loading the divine data crystals onto her sky ship. After securing nearly 100 of the most important MEs, Inanna declared the hour was late and made her excuses, leaving Enki to pass out amongst the remnants of the feast. She made a swift and silent departure, her ship rising into the night sky, laden with stolen treasure. The next morning, Enki awoke to a pounding headache and the horrifying realization that his sacred storerooms were empty. He had been played. In a fury, he summoned his two-faced vizier, Izimud, and dispatched him along with a host of terrifying sea creatures to chase down Inanna and retrieve the stolen property. The pursuit was frantic. 6 times, Isimud's forces caught up to Inanna's ship, only to be outsmarted and outfought by the warrior goddess. She was not just a pretty face. She was a masterful pilot and a ruthless combatant. She arrived back at her city of Uruk in triumph. As the cheering crowds watched, she unloaded the sacred Mies, and in that moment, the soul of civilization was transferred to her city. Uruk became the new center of the world, and Inanna, its powerful, self-made queen. She had proven to the old god that in this new age, power was not simply inherited. It could be won with a smile, a drink, and a very, very fast getaway ship. Inanna's audacious heist of the Emmys sent ripples through the divine hierarchy. The younger generation of gods watched her meteoric rise with a mixture of shock, envy, and inspiration. She had proven that the rigid post-diluvian order established by the elder gods was not as immutable as it seemed. And no one was watching more closely than Enki's firstborn son, Marduk. Marduk was a being forged from his father's genius and a pride that was entirely his own. He was a master of the sciences, a brilliant engineer, and a student of the celestial cycles. But he was also a prince, nursing a deep and abiding grievance. He believed his father Enki, as the firstborn of Anu, had been cheated of the throne of Nibiru. By extension, he felt that he, Marduk, was the rightful heir to leadership on earth. Yet by the rigid laws of succession, command had fallen to Enlil and his clan. His family, the Enkites, had been given the second region of Egypt as a consolation prize. To Marduk, ruling the fertile Nile Valley felt like being made the manager of a very successful but remote branch office, while his cousins got to run the headquarters in Mesopotamia under his father's guidance. Marduk had been instrumental in developing the land of Egypt. He helped oversee the construction of magnificent structures, including the Great Pyramids on the Giza Plateau. In the eons to come, human pharaohs would claim them as their own tombs, but in their true origin, they were Anunnaki constructs of incredible power and purpose, landing beacons for spacecraft, vast energy generators, and the control center for a new post-flood spaceport. Marduk was proud of this incredible work, but his pride was soured by the knowledge that it served the collective mission, an enterprise still under the ultimate command of his great rival, Enlil. He saw Inanna, a lesser royal, carve out a kingdom for herself in Uruk through sheer audacity, and a slow-burning fire was kindled within him. If she could challenge the old order, then so could he. And his ambition was far greater than hers. He didn't just want a city. He wanted supremacy. He decided that his future would not be in Egypt. He needed a power base in the first region, in the heartland of his enemies, in Mesopotamia itself. He traveled north and chose his ground. It was a small, strategically located, but otherwise unremarkable settlement on the banks of the Euphrates River. Its Sumerian name was Ka, Dingir, Ra, the Gate of the Gods. The world would come to know it by its Akkadian name, Babylon. It was here that Marduk would make his stand. Historians still argue about the early history of Babylon, but in the mythological timeline of the gods, its destiny was intertwined with its ambitious patron deity long before it rose to historical prominence. Marduk began to gather followers, attracting other disaffected Anunnaki and a growing number of humans who were captivated by his charisma and his promise of a new age. He then made his brazen claim. He asserted that the celestial cycles were turning. The old age, the age of the bull, Taurus, which was dominated by Enlil, was coming to an end. A new age, the age of the ram, Aries, was dawning, and the fates had decreed that he, Marduk, was to be its celestial lord. He began to promote a new theology, one that placed him at the top of the pantheon. He argued that the original sin of the Anunnaki was the usurpation of his father Enki's birthright, and that the time had come to correct this ancient wrong by elevating him, Enki's son, to his rightful place as ruler of all the Anunnaki on earth. It was a brilliant and deeply subversive ideological attack. He wasn't just claiming a piece of territory. He was challenging the entire legal and religious foundation of Enlil's authority. He began to slowly build up Babylon, not as a fortress, but as the center of his new movement. It became a place of pilgrimage for those who felt constrained by the rigid doctrines of Enlil's command in Nippur. Marduk's approach was patient, a slow and steady gathering of strength, a stark contrast to Inanna's flashy raid. He knew he could not yet challenge the Enlilites militarily. Instead, he would challenge them philosophically, building his power base from the inside out. His quiet, brooding presence in Babylon was a festering splinter in the side of the establishment, a constant, low-grade infection that Enlil could not ignore. The son of the god of wisdom was playing a long game, and his patient, simmering ambition would prove to be a far more enduring threat to the peace of the world than anyone yet realized. Marduk's patient ambition, simmering for decades in the heart of Mesopotamia, finally boiled over into a grand, audacious project. He was tired of being a lord in exile, a preacher of a new age with no cathedral to call his own. He needed a symbol, a great physical testament to his claim of supremacy that would be visible to gods and men alike. He announced to his growing legion of followers that they would build a tower in the center of his city, Babylon. This would be no mere temple. It would be a ziggurat of unprecedented scale and design. Its Sumerian name would be Enki, the temple of the foundation of heaven and earth. And its top, he declared to the cheering crowds, would reach directly into the heavens, a man-made mountain to serve as a gateway for the gods. The project was, in every sense of the word, a vanity project of cosmic proportions. For the human workers who flocked to Babylon from all corners of the land, it was a noble and pious undertaking, a way to honor their charismatic new leader. To Marduk, it was a calculated move in the great game. The tower's official purpose was to unify humanity. Its secret purpose was to serve as his own private space facility, a launch and communications tower that would make him independent of Enlil's official spaceport and give him direct access to the heavens. The timing was perfect. In this era, according to the ancient texts, the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. This linguistic unity was the key to Marduk's plan. It allowed for a level of cooperation and coordination among the human workforce that had never been seen before. Masons from the north could work seamlessly with brick makers from the south. The project became a melting pot of human ingenuity, all speaking the same tongue and all working towards the same goal, the glorification of Marduk. The great tower began to rise from the plains, a marvel of engineering and a testament to what a unified humanity could achieve. But as the structure climbed higher, casting its long shadow over the Mesopotamian landscape, the mood in Enlil's capital of Nippur grew darker. Enlil and his sons watched the tower's progress with mounting alarm. They saw it not as a temple, but as a fortress. They saw the unified human workforce not as pious laborers, but as Marduk's private army, a single, controllable entity that could be wielded against them. Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. Enlil is recorded as saying in the biblical account, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. He saw Marduk's project as an existential threat. A direct military strike on Babylon was ruled out. It would trigger an all-out war between the divine clans, a conflict that would tear the recovering world apart. Enlil's council needed a more elegant, more insidious solution. They would not destroy the tower. They would destroy the very thing that made its construction possible. They would destroy the unity of mankind. In the dead of night, while the work camps around Babylon slept, a team of Enlilite Anunnaki descended. They did not carry weapons of terror, but instruments of a far more subtle power. They moved like ghosts through the sleeping city, deploying a technology that targeted the language centers of the human brain, scrambling the neural pathways that governed speech. It was a silent, invisible, and devastatingly effective act of divine sabotage. The next morning, the sun rose on chaos. A foreman shouted an order, and the words that came out were a garbled, guttural mess. A laborer asked his friend for water, but the friend heard only meaningless sounds and responded in an equally alien tongue. Panic erupted. Where there had been seamless communication, there was now a wall of babble. People gesticulated wildly, their faces contorted with confusion and growing fear. No one could understand anyone else. The site of the world's greatest construction project devolved into a pit of frustration and suspicion. It was the ultimate communication breakdown, a divine prank call on a global scale. The great work on the tower ground to an immediate and permanent halt. The unified human race had been shattered into 1,000 linguistic fragments. Frightened and isolated, people began to seek out the few others who spoke as they did. The work camps dissolved as these new tribes, these new peoples, abandoned the unfinished tower and scattered in all directions, each seeking a new home for their own kind. Marduk's grand ambition lay in ruins. His unified power base was gone, broken into pieces and scattered to the four corners of the world. He remained in his near-empty city of Babylon, staring at the silent, unfinished monument to his failure, his heart filled with a bitterness that would poison the ages. Enlil had won the battle, but in doing so, he had sowed the seeds of a new and enduring kind of conflict. The eternal strife between the nations, tribes, and tongues of a now permanently divided humanity. The fall of the Tower of Babel did not bring peace. It brought a new and more fractured kind of chaos. Marduk's dream of a unified humanity under his command was shattered, but Enlil's solution had created a dozen smaller problems in its place. The earth was now a patchwork quilt of competing tribes and nascent nations, separated by the new and baffling walls of language. This division, intended to weaken Marduk, had an unforeseen consequence. It made humanity the perfect set of pawns for the next stage of the divine conflict. The elder gods could no longer risk open warfare against each other. The memory of the flood and the destruction of their own infrastructure was too fresh. So they innovated. They invented a new kind of war, fought not face to face, but through proxies. They would arm their loyal human subjects, train them in the art of combat, and set them upon the human subjects of their rivals. It was a horrifyingly efficient way to settle a divine family feud, complete with armies, air support, and tragically disposable soldiers. The first of these great proxy conflicts would be remembered as the Pyramid Wars. The flashpoint was, as always, a dispute over the most vital strategic assets on the planet, the space facilities. Marduk, after his humiliation at Babylon, had returned to the domain of his father Enki in Egypt. He argued that since the Giza complex, with its Great Pyramid acting as the primary landing beacon, was in his family's territory, it should be under his command. Enlil and his sons, who controlled the main spaceport in the Sinai Peninsula, vehemently disagreed. They saw the Giza pyramids and the Sinai spaceport as a single, integrated system belonging to the entire mission, not to one faction. At its core, the dispute was about control over space travel itself. Whoever controlled the port controlled the flow of gold to Nibiru and held the ultimate key to power on Earth. Marduk, tired of being sidelined, decided to force the issue. He reasserted his authority in Egypt and began to move his loyal human forces toward the Sinai, signaling his intent to seize the spaceport. The Enlilites responded in force. The war that erupted was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. On the ground, newly formed human armies clashed in brutal, primitive combat with bronze spears and shields. But above them, the true battle raged. The Anunaki commanders led their troops from the sky, piloting their roaring sky ships. The champions of the two factions, the great warrior son of Enlil, Ninurta, and the determined Marduk himself, engaged in terrifying aerial duels above the fray. Their weapons were not of this world. They unleashed beams of brilliant, searing light that could turn sand to glass, and blasts of force that could level entire battalions. This new, terrifying form of combat, a mixture of ancient and futuristic warfare, left an indelible mark on human memory. Scholars have long been puzzled by descriptions in texts, like the Hindu Mahabharata or the Hebrew Old Testament, which speak of god heroes wielding weapons that cause the sun to tremble and the earth to shake, of flying chariots and arrows of fire. Descriptions that sound eerily like modern, high-tech weaponry. These were not metaphors. They were the fragmented memories of the battles of the gods. The war raged across the deserts of Egypt and the Near East. Control of the Great Pyramids and the Sinai spaceport shifted back and forth. The warrior Inanna, ever the opportunist and firmly allied with her Enlilite kin, joined the fray, her own squadron of ships turning the tide in several key battles. She reveled in the chaos, the perfect expression of her dual nature as a goddess of both passion and destruction. But in the end, the combined might of the Enlilite forces, led by the tactical brilliance of Ninurta, proved to be too much for Marduk. His armies were broken, and he was forced into a humiliating retreat. Ninurta's forces secured the Sinai spaceport and established a heavily armed perimeter. The First Pyramid War was over. A tense and bitter peace settled over the land. Marduk was once again defeated, forced into another period of exile, his dreams of supremacy dashed. But he was not destroyed. His rage and his sense of injustice now calcified into a cold, diamond-hard obsession with revenge. The war had a devastating cost. Thousands of human lives had been extinguished to settle a political squabble between their divine masters. Cities had been razed, and the once hopeful new world was now scarred by the reality of divinely orchestrated warfare. A dangerous precedent had been set. The gods now knew how to wage war upon each other without risking their own lives, and humanity had learned the art of killing in the name of its gods. The fragile peace was not a resolution. It was merely an intermission. The final, most terrible act of their conflict was now all but inevitable. The centuries that followed the Pyramid Wars were a time of simmering resentment and patient strategy. While the Enlilite gods consolidated their control over the vital spaceport, Marduk, the defeated prince, embarked on a different kind of conquest. He had learned from his failures. Military might alone was not enough. He needed to win the hearts and minds of humanity. He returned to his city of Babylon and transformed himself from a warrior into a political and spiritual mastermind. He patiently cultivated his city, turning it into the cultural and scientific capital of the world. Under his patronage, Babylonian priests became masters of astronomy, mapping the heavens with an accuracy that would not be matched for millennia. He gave them the foundations of mathematics. He taught them the secrets of governance and law. Marduk's comeback tour was, by any measure, a stunning success. His influence spread from Babylon throughout Mesopotamia. As human kings, drawn to his power and wisdom, swore fealty to him, one by one, conquering the old Sumerian cities in his name. Finally, the time was ripe for his ultimate claim. Through his human priests and scribes, he commissioned a new, grand religious text, the Enuma Elish. It was a masterful piece of propaganda, a rewriting of history and cosmology that cast him, Marduk, not as a rebellious son, but as the heroic, central figure of creation, the one who had defeated the forces of chaos and brought order to the universe. In this new telling, he was the rightful heir to the Enlilship, the supreme authority over Earth. He had not just built a kingdom, he had created a new religion with himself at its center, effectively declaring himself the new king of the gods. This theological coup was backed by a very real military threat. His loyal human armies, now the most powerful force in the land, once again marched toward the Sinai Peninsula. Their goal to finally seize the spaceport and sever the Enlilites' connection to Nibiru. This was the final crisis. The Anunnaki leadership convened in a grim emergency council. The situation was far more dire than during the Pyramid Wars. Marduk now controlled most of the first region. His ideological power was immense, and his armies were poised to capture their most critical asset. They were on the brink of total defeat. The options were debated in a tense, hushed panic. They could surrender and accept Marduk's rule, a possibility Enlil refused to even consider. They could engage in another proxy war, but this time they were likely to lose. They could engage in open warfare, God against God, but this was strictly forbidden, as it risked the use of technologies that could critically damage the planet itself. The council was deadlocked, staring into the abyss of their own defeat. It was then that a fourth, unthinkable option was brought to the table. The proposal came from Nergal, a son of Enki, who was a grim and terrifying deity of the underworld and pestilence. He argued that since Marduk threatened their very existence on Earth, they were justified in using the ultimate deterrent. He reminded the council of the 7 weapons of terror that Alalu had brought to Earth, the nuclear missiles that had been held in a secure, undisclosed location, and whose use was the ultimate taboo. He proposed a surgical strike, not against Babylon, which would martyr Marduk, but against the prize itself. They would use one or two of the weapons to completely annihilate the spaceport in the Sinai, making it unusable for anyone. To further cripple Marduk's war effort, he suggested they also destroy several key cities in the region that were famously loyal to Marduk and his human allies, cities that would be remembered in legend as Sodom and Gomorrah. The horrifying story of this decision is echoed in the ancient Mesopotamian text known as the Era Epos, which speaks of the god Era, Nergal, being convinced to unleash his 7 weapons to lay waste to the land, an event that brings about an age of darkness and suffering. Enki was horrified, pleading with the council. "Are you mad?" he begged. "You would poison our own world, create a wound that will never heal, just to deny our brother a victory." But fear is a powerful motivator. Inanna, the warrior goddess, argued fiercely in favor of the plan, as did Enlil's son, Ninutta. They saw it as the only way to stop Marduk for good. The final vote was called. Enki and the few who sided with him were overruled. The council, in a decision born of terror and desperation, gave its consent. The ultimate taboo was to be broken. The fate of the ancient world was sealed not with a clash of armies, but with a quiet, horrifying vote in a council chamber of the gods. The fateful decision was made. There would be no more proxy wars, no more political maneuvering. The Anunnaki Council, backed into a corner by Marduk's unstoppable rise, had chosen the ultimate solution. 2 gods were tasked with the grim mission: Ninutta, Enlil's heroic son and chief enforcer, and Nergal, the dark god of the underworld, who had proposed the terrible plan. There was no ceremony, no triumphant departure. They left in their swift skyships under a veil of secrecy, carrying with them the launch codes for the 7 weapons of terror, the very instruments of cosmic power they had sworn never to use on Earth. Their flight path took them west, towards the Great Green Sea, and then south over the desolate lands of the Sinai Peninsula. Their first targets were not the spaceport itself, but the human cities in the fertile valley south of the Dead Sea. The cities whose kings were fanatically loyal to Marduk, and whose armies were massing for the final assault. The cities that would enter human memory as Sodom and Gomorrah. From high above, the gods looked down, and then they unleashed the first weapon. A flash of light, brighter and more terrifying than the sun itself, momentarily blinded the heavens. A monstrous, mushroom-shaped cloud climbed into the sky, and the city below simply ceased to exist, vaporized in an instant of unimaginable heat. A second weapon fell, and then a third, until the entire lush valley was a smoking, blackened ruin, with Marduk's allies erased from the face of the earth. They turned to their primary target, the Sinai spaceport. This was the Anunnaki's jewel in the desert, their link to the stars, and now, to deny it to their rival, they had to destroy it. They unleashed the remaining weapons upon the complex. The explosions tore the peninsula apart, carving vast, unnatural craters into the rock and sand, melting the great landing platforms and control centers into glass. In a matter of moments, the most advanced technological site on the planet was reduced to a blackened, smoldering scar. Their mission was complete. The spaceport was gone forever. It was a brutal, efficient, and they believed, a contained act of strategic destruction. They had performed their surgical strike, with terrible precision. But they had failed to account for the wind. A dark, ominous cloud, pregnant with the poison of the god's fury, began to gather in the sky above the smoldering ruins. Then, a strange and unnatural wind began to blow, not from the east as was its custom, but from the west, carrying the great cloud with it. This was the beginning of the evil wind, a catastrophe described in harrowing detail in the ancient Sumerian texts known as the Lamentations for Ur and other cities. These are not myths of conquest, but baffled, heartbreaking accounts of a silent, invisible death that swept over their land. The dark cloud drifted eastward, over the mountains, and began to settle like a funeral shroud over the fertile plains of southern Mesopotamia, over Sumer itself. It descended first upon Enki's holy city of Eridu, the birthplace of their entire earthly endeavor. Then it moved on, a slow, creeping wave of death, to the great cities of Ur, Lagash, and finally to Enlil's own capital, the sacred city of Nibiru. The destruction was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, suffocating horror. A bitter, metallic taste filled the air. The sun was blotted out by a brown haze, turning noon into a sickly twilight. Then the people began to die. They fell in the streets, in their homes, in the temples, with no wounds upon them. They coughed up blood as their insides were consumed by the invisible poison. The cattle dropped dead in the fields. The fish floated to the surface of the canals, and a brittle, grey dust settled on everything, making the very soil sterile. The vibrant, noisy heartland of Sumerian civilization fell silent. The Anunaki, in their high temples and ziggurats, were not immune. The poison seeped through their walls, and they too began to feel its effects. One by one, the great gods were forced to abandon their beloved cities. Nanarsin fled Ur. Inanna abandoned her great city of Uruk. Enki left Eridu. And finally, Enlil himself was forced to flee his sacred throne in Nippur. They scattered in every direction, becoming refugees from a disaster of their own making. In the ultimate tragic irony, their attempt to destroy Marduk's power base had resulted in the complete and utter annihilation of their own. The evil wind had done what Marduk never could. It had defeated them. The golden age of Sumer was over, brought to an end not by a foreign army, but by a divine act of friendly fire. The evil wind passed, but it left behind a world of silence. The great cities of Sumer, the pride of Enlil's clan, and the vibrant heart of civilization were now glittering tombs covered in a fine, grey, poisonous dust. The fields were barren, the canals were choked with sludge, and the only sound was the mournful whisper of the wind through the empty streets. The Anunnaki had won their war against Marduk, but in doing so had nuked their own capital. It was the ultimate Pyrrhic victory. And in the north, by a simple accident of meteorology, the city of Babylon remained untouched. As the radioactive cloud had drifted east and south, it had missed Marduk's city completely. While his rivals were now homeless refugees, their lands uninhabitable for centuries to come, Marduk and his followers were safe. He had won the throne of earth not by conquest, but by default. The last man standing after his opponents had burned their own house down. The end of the Sumerian civilization around 2000 BCE is a topic of great historical debate, with theories ranging from climate change to foreign invasion. The ancient Sumerian texts themselves, however, the lamentations written by the survivors, tell a story not of a slow decline, but of a sudden, unnatural, and devastating calamity, an evil storm that came from the west and killed everything in its path, forcing even the gods to flee in terror. With Sumer now a poisoned wasteland, the center of human life and power shifted. Refugees, both human and Anunnaki, flocked to the one place that was safe, Babylon. Marduk, his authority now absolute and uncontested, was declared the supreme god. The age of Enlil was officially over. The age of Marduk, the age of Aries, had begun. In some remote, uncontaminated corner of the world, the scattered and defeated leaders of the Anunnaki held one final, heartbreaking council. Enlil, the once proud lord of the command, was a broken being. His cities were gone, his people were dead or scattered, and his authority was dust. His grand earth mission, the quest for gold to save Nibiru, had ended in this utter, self-inflicted catastrophe. The spaceport was a crater. The heartland was a toxic waste dump. The human experiment had spiraled into a nightmare. There was nothing left to command. A consensus was reached. It was time to go home. Their departure was not a grand, triumphant exodus. It was a quiet, staggered withdrawal, a slow fade into myth. Some, like the disgraced Enlil, gathered what was left of their loyal followers and used what remaining skyships they had to make the long, final journey back to Nibiru, leaving the world they had shaped and shattered forever. Others chose to remain, but their roles changed. They retreated from the open glare of kingship into the shadows of mystery. Enki, the creator, became a reclusive figure of legend, a god of hidden wisdom. Inanna, her ambitions finally checked, transformed into a celestial memory, the goddess of the planet Venus. They ceased to be kings and became inspirations for oracles, the secret teachers of mystery schools, the whispered voices in the ears of human prophets. They left humanity to govern itself, to muddle through history on its own. But they left behind a powerful and enduring legacy. Their stories, sanitized and mythologized, became the religions of the world. The bloodlines of the human kings they had appointed became the basis for the divine right to rule. The science they had taught became the foundation of astronomy and mathematics. And they left one final, potent promise, a thread of hope woven into the fabric of nearly every culture on Earth, that one day, when the celestial cycles were right and their great planet, Nibiru, returned once more to the inner solar system, they too would return. The age of direct rule was over. The long goodbye had ended, and for the first time, humanity was truly alone, left to build its own destiny upon the ruins of a divine war, forever looking to the stars and waiting. And so, the grand, tumultuous story of our celestial parents comes to a quiet close. The thunder of their skyships and the flash of their terrible weapons have long since faded into the mists of antiquity, leaving behind only the faintest of echoes in our oldest stories and our most sacred myths. The gods have retreated to their distant heavens, and the world they left behind has been allowed to spin in a long, slow, and blessed silence. The great ziggurats now sleep under the desert sands, their purpose forgotten, their creators having become the stuff of dreams. And as you too now drift toward that gentle and quiet place, you can let the weight of this epic story settle and dissolve. The struggles are over. The cosmic battles are won and lost, and all that remains is the peaceful, steady turning of the earth and the silent, watchful company of the stars. The world is quiet now. The sky is clear, and all that is asked of you is to breathe, to relax, and to let the soft blanket of the night carry you into a deep and untroubled rest, where perhaps, in your own dreams, you may just catch a final, fading whisper of a time when giants truly walked the earth.